Chapter 18 of Ester Ried Yet Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ester Ried Yet Speaking by Pansy. Chapter 18. Yourn's the Way. You are not to suppose, because this first Monday evening, which, by the way, was concluded with sandwiches and coffee, was a success, pronounced so by all concerned, that therefore the ones which followed were all rose color. Fortunately, not one of the workers expected this, and so were brave and cheerful under drawbacks. These were numerous and varied. After the first novelty wore off, it took at times only the most trivial excuses to keep the boys away. Sometimes when they called, their conduct was anything but encouraging. They lolled in the easy chairs, smelling strongly of tobacco and other bar-room odors, refused insolently to apply themselves to any work at hand, audibly pronounced the whole thing "slow," and in numberless ways severely tried the patience of both Alfred and Gracie. For the others, they had counted the cost, at least the gentlemen had, and expected to move slowly, even to appear to go backward some of the time. As for Mrs. Roberts, I have told you that she worked in a peculiar manner, with the motto, "This one thing I do," apparently ever before her. Each evening was distinct in itself, with efforts to make and obstacles to overcome, and at its close she had a way of laying it aside, as something with which her part was done, not attempting even to calculate results. Then she was ready to turn to a new day, and work steadily for that. The winter was slipping away, and Gracie Dennis lingered. She could hardly have told you why, yet there were many apparent reasons. Mrs. Roberts wanted her, rejoiced in her, and coaxed irresistibly as often as the thought of going home was mentioned. Then Gracie, laugh over the peculiar work going on as she might, was undeniably interested in those boys. She was working for them, therefore of course she was interested. "I don't see how you can go this week," would young Ried say to her with a perplexed air. "You know we have that matter all planned for next Monday evening. How can we carry out the scheme if you are not there to do your part?" Then would Gracie laugh and demur, and admit, to herself only, that it was very pleasant to be needed, as she certainly was, for one night more, and so the nights passed. Her work was to be Professor of Elocution, as Mr. Roberts gaily called her when the workers were alone together. It had been discovered that she could read both prose and poetry with effect. So a reading class was organized, and they chose for the first evening, not one of Bryant's or Whittier's gems, nor selections from Milton or Shakespeare, which would have suited part of the company, nor yet the easy readings in some standard spelling book, which would have fitted the capacity of the others, but with great care and much discussion, one of Will Carleton's descriptive poems, full of homely yet tender language, full of pathos and of humor, was unanimously selected. The first evening reading had been commenced with Nuts and Apples. There are those who can see no connection between this and the intellectual. Happily for the characters with whom she had to deal, Mrs. Roberts was not one of them. While the others were still enjoying the refreshments, she took the book and read. This was her quiet little sacrifice. It was not pleasant to her to become a public reader. It required courage to get through with one verse, with Dr. Everett sitting opposite, and Gracie Dennis on a low seat at her side, and her husband listening intently. Mrs. Roberts was not a good reader, and was aware of it. She pronounced the words correctly, it is true, but when you had said that, you had said all that there was to offer in praise of her effort. She had some exasperating faults, but she bravely read the first two verses, and some of the boys listened, and one of them laughed. He had caught a gleam of the fun in the poem. This, of course, was Nimble Dick. Then Alfred Ried made the same effort on the same verses. His performance was very little better, and he, too, knew it. He could write, but he was by no means a public reader. This was his offering to the general good. If those fellows, by reason of his mistakes, could be induced to climb, he was willing to offer his pride on the altar. No matter by what petty trials they were caught, so that they were really caught. Then followed Gracie Dennis, and her own father, acceptable preacher though he was, might with credit to himself have taken lessons of her. She was certainly, for one so young and unprofessional, a magnificent reader. So indeed was Marion Wilbur, and she had enjoyed teaching Gracie. The poem blossomed in her hand. The crunching of nuts and apples entirely ceased. The boys sat erect and listened and laughed and flushed and swallowed suspiciously over some of the homely pathos. They had never heard anything like that before, and they evidently appreciated it. She read it through to the end. Then were unloosed the tongues. They exclaimed in delight. "What an accomplishment it is!" said Mr. Roberts, "and how few possess it. Doctor, how many really fine readers have you heard in your life?" "About 3," said the doctor laconically. "Well," said Mrs. Roberts, "let us all be exceptions. Gracie, teach us how. I will try again." And she did, on the first verse of the poem, with better success than before, but how sharp the contrast between her reading and Gracie's, she knew. It was not easy for her to read. "I don't know, possibly I am mistaken, but it seems to me that I have known people ready for large sacrifices, who would yet shrink painfully from these little ones." In discussing the program for the evening, the question had been, when each had done his part, how were they to influence the boys to join? Could they join? Was it possible that they knew enough about reading to attempt to speak the words of the poem? With reference to this obstacle, a poem had been chosen full of simple, homely words, such as are in common use. Especially was the first verse free from what Mr. Roberts called shoals. Having heard the verse read several times, it was hoped that some one of the 7 might have courage to attempt it, but Gracie did not believe that such would be the case. "I don't see how we can ask them, and do it naturally," said Dr. Everett. "It is such an unheard of thing, you know, and I am afraid, do our best, it will present itself to them as a patronage, and that will be fatal. The people who are low enough to need patronage are the very ones who won't endure it." Whereupon various ways of managing the matter were discussed and discarded. Suddenly Mrs. Roberts turned to her young lieutenant, who had been silent for some time, and said: "What are you thinking of, Mr. Ried? Do you see a way out?" "No," he said, "I have neither knowledge nor skill in such matters, but my thoughts just then were far away. I was thinking how curiously certain apparently trivial instances of one's childhood will stand out with almost startling prominence." "What sent you off in that direction?" questioned Dr. Everett. "There must have been an association of ideas." "Oh, there was. I was thinking how vividly I remembered a discussion between my mother and my sister, younger than Ester, in regard to some matter which perplexed them; and when they could come to no satisfactory conclusion they appealed to my sister Ester, who was resting as usual on her lounge. I can seem to hear her voice as she said: 'We haven't to do anything about it until to morrow. Perhaps to morrow will have a light of its own for our direction.'" "Thank you," Mrs. Roberts said, her eyes lighting with an appreciative smile. "We have not to do anything about this until Monday night, and perhaps Monday night will see us wise." I don't know how many thought of this little conversation when Monday evening came, but certainly Alfred Ried and Mrs. Roberts did, for she glanced at him and smiled significantly when Dr. Everett, having apparently forgotten that anything beyond their own pleasure was in contemplation, challenged Gracie to a discussion as to the emphasis on a certain word in the second line. He had never heard it so read, and he called for an analysis that would sustain the reading, and received it, and was not yet prepared to yield the point, but read the verse as he imagined it should be read, and then Gracie, at Mr. Roberts' call, repeated it with her rendering, and I am not sure but all parties concerned actually forgot their final object in the interest of the discussion, until they were suddenly called to it by an interrupting voice. "Yourn's the way," it said, with an emphatic nod of a shock of matted hair, "yourn's the way." It was Dirk Colson. He had forgotten for the moment that anybody was listening to him, save the 2 readers. He was looking directly at Gracie, and the nods were evidently intended for her. "Of course it is," she said eagerly, her face flushing with a triumph that had nothing to do with the right emphasis. "You read it, won't you, and show these people that we are right?" Afterward Mrs. Roberts confessed that she involuntarily placed her hand on her heart, with a dim idea of hushing its beating, lest others could hear, so important to her did the moment seem. Dr. Everett looked dismayed. The least hopeful one of the 7 seemed Dirk. None of them knew of his dangerous talent for imitation. None of them believed that he would make any attempt at reading, but thought he would shrink into deeper sullenness. All of them were mistaken. He reached for the book, glanced for a moment over the lines, and then read the verse, with so complete an imitation of Gracie Dennis, and yet with a voice and manner that so fitted the homely words and the homely scene described, that the effect was actually better than when Gracie read. Instinctively the cultured portion of his audience greeted the effort with a clapping of hands. The blood, meantime, rolled in dark waves over Dirk's face. He had been cheered before. None of his present applauders could imagine what a set had often clapped their hands over his successful imitations, but Dirk, who liked applause as well as other human beings do, had never, in his wildest stretches of imagination, placed himself before such people as listened now and received their approval. Great was the excitement and satisfaction. The 6 companions, far from feeling any emotion of jealousy, seemed greatly elated, believing that one of their number had made a hit and increased their importance. No one else could be found to attempt the verse. Nimble Dick shook his head good-naturedly, and declared that he would rather "undertake to run an engine to Californy" than try it. And the others were of like mind. Then came Gracie to the front again. "I'll tell you what you must all do. I have been experimenting with that typewriter, Mr. Roberts, all the week. You know it will manifold, with the use of carbon paper, and it chances that when I was seized with a desire to try its powers in that direction, I choose this very verse to copy. So I have 15 good copies in print. You must each take a copy and make this verse a study until next Monday. Then I shall challenge you all to sustain me in my reading." This proposition was hailed with such satisfaction by the older members that it immediately became popular, and each boy received his copy mechanically and gazed at it curiously. But Dirk Colson's thoughts were turned in a new channel. "Look here," he said, detaining Gracie by an imperious inclination of his head as she handed him the copy. "How did you make these? Didn't you print them 15 times? I don't understand what you said." "Why, no," said Gracie. "The machine will manifold. I'll show you. Come over to the end window. It stands there waiting to be displayed, and it is a little wonder." Then they crowded around the typewriter, and Gracie, really proud of the skill she had acquired in a week's time, showed off the little wonder to great advantage. The fact that the typewriter was new to most of the others, that they were decidedly ignorant as to its working, increased the comfort of the hour by doing away with the embarrassing feeling that any one of them was playing a part. Dr. Everett was no more familiar with the typewriter than was Dirk Colson, and was just as eager to know about it. Also everybody, apparently, felt an equally strong desire to write his name on the marvelous little creature, and each in turn sat down before it, and moved his awkward hands with nearly equal slowness over the keys, picking out the magic letters. It was this episode that made the workers, during their next conference, branch out into new lines. "We need something," said Dr. Everett, walking up and down the floor in puzzled thought. "We need something that shall be a genuine common interest, of which we are all, or all but one, equally ignorant. Something that we can take hold of with zest, on as low a platform as the most ignorant of those seen. I was convinced of that when I saw the abandon with which we all went into the typewriter business, with a naturalness and equality that, in the matter of reading and writing, it is impossible for us to feel. If the machine were complicated, so that it would take us each 3 months or so to master it, that would do. What can we take up that will place us on a level?" End of chapter 18. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 19 of Ester Ried Yet Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ester Ried Yet Speaking by Pansy. Chapter 19. We have begun backwards. "Well," said Mr. Ried, "we should want to have one of our number not 'on a level.' How would it do to appoint you, sir, to give us a few lectures in hygiene, popular lectures about air and exercise and ventilation and bathing, and all sorts of everyday topics, about which people are ignorant?" "That's a capital idea, Reed. Those fellows could certainly be benefited by a little attention to such questions; and I'm sure the rest of us would like to hear of the principles which govern these important laws. Such lectures put into popular form are decidedly interesting, I think. Let us vote for them." This was Mr. Roberts' hearty seconding. But the doctor laughed. "There is a ludicrous side to it which you do not see," he said. "Imagine me holding forth on the importance of ventilation, for instance, to a poor fellow who comes from a region where father and mother, and a horde of children of both sexes and all ages, crowd together in one room, and that a cellar, where the sun never penetrates and the air that crawls in through the one small window is reeking with even more impurities than can be found inside. Or talking about bathing, to the poor wretches who have no clothing to change, and barely water enough, by carrying it long distances, to satisfy their most pressing needs. Still, Reed, I'm not quarreling with your idea. There is a sensible side to it. There are things that I could tell even those boys which might interest them, and would probably be to their advantage to know. The subject is one which can be popularized to suit even such an audience. I'll try for it occasionally if it shall seem best; but it doesn't meet my demand. I want us all on a platform where we shall start in equal ignorance and get on together. Of course you are all the more or less familiar with all the facts that I should have to present, and the boys would know it. They are sharp fellows; it wouldn't take them an hour to discover that we were fishing for them; and if there is any one thing on which they were at present determined, it is, probably, that they will not be benefited. What is there that one of us knows, of which the others are ignorant? French won't do, for Miss Dennis is acquainted with that language, I think, and so are you, Reed, are you not?" "Well, I can stammer through a few sentences. I don't speak it like a native, as you do." At this revelation a vivid blush glowed on Gracie Dennis's cheek. She remembered Professor Ellis's comments in French. Then the doctor had understood, though his face was so imperturbable. What could he have thought of the courtesy of her guest? Meantime, Mr. Ried wore a perplexed face. "You are right," he said to the doctor. "We are not enough on a level. I felt our advantage last night, when Miss Dennis was explaining the typewriter, but I don't see the way clear. What subject is there on which all but one of us could meet on common ground, and that one could turn professor?" Here interposed Mr. Roberts, speaking in a meek tone of voice. "If I were not a modest man I should venture a suggestion. As it is, I really don't know what to do." The doctor turned to him quickly. "Out with it, man. If you are master of a profession or a trade or a theory unknown to the rest of us, you are bound on your honor as a member of this unique organization to present it." At the same moment Mrs. Roberts came to his aid. "Oh, Evan, teach us shorthand." Whereupon Mr. Roberts heaved what was intended to appear as a relieved sigh, and announced that his modesty was preserved. Upon this suggestion they seized with eagerness. Not one of them knew anything about phonetic writing save Mr. Roberts, and he was master of the art. "It is the very thing," the doctor said with heartiness. "I should like exceedingly to learn it, and Reed and the ladies may be able to make it useful in 100 ways; and as for the 7, if they really master it, it may be the foundation of a fortune for some of them." So, without more ado, it was planned that at the very next Monday evening the subject should be skillfully presented, its importance and its fascinations discussed, and the boys be beguiled into taking the first lesson, sandwiched in between the all-important reading and writing lessons. Alas for plans! On the very next Monday the conspirators, with the exception of young Reed, were together by 7 o'clock. The faint aroma of coffee floated through the room. A fruit basket filled with oranges occupied a conspicuous table, and everything waited for the guests. While they waited, instead of enjoying themselves as the 4 were certainly capable of doing, they were noticeably restless, listened for the shuffling of careless feet on the steps, and the sound of uncultured voices in the hall, and waited expectantly whenever the bell pealed, only to be obliged to send word to some caller that "Mr. and Mrs. Roberts were engaged." The special occupation of the 4 seemed to be to look at their watches and to remark that the doctor's was a trifle fast, and to wonder if 7:30 would be a more suitable hour for the boys, and to wonder what could be detaining Ried. At last it was 7:30, and then it was 15 minutes of 8, and then it was 10 minutes of 8. And then the doorbell rang again. It was Ried, and he was alone. One glance at his distressed face told the lookers-on that something was amiss, even before he exclaimed: "You won't see a boy to-night." "Why? What is the trouble? Where are they?" These were the various ways of putting the same question. "One of the McCollum partners has become interested in the boys, it seems, and has concluded that he will try what he can do towards their elevation. So he has commenced by presenting each one of them with a ticket to the Green Street Theater, and there they are at this moment." This startling intelligence was variously received. Dr. Everett exclaimed: "Is it possible?" Gracie Dennis remarked that it was something like what she expected. Mrs. Roberts said not a word, and Mr. Roberts added to the astonishment of the moment by bursting into a laugh. Poor Ried seemed to feel the laugh more than anything. His face gathered into heavier clouds than before. He bit his lip to hold back the vexed words that were just ready to burst forth, and strode almost angrily into the further corner of the room. An embarrassed silence seemed to fall upon the others. At least Gracie felt embarrassed, the doctor looked simply expectant. At last Mr. Roberts drew himself up from his lounging attitude, and broke into the stillness. "Ah, now, good people, don't let us make serious mistakes. Come back here, my dear young brother, and let us look this thing in the face, and talk it over calmly. Are we children playing at benevolence that at the first discouragement we should cry out, 'All is lost,' and retire vanquished? Come, I laughed because really this does not seem such a serious matter to me as it seems to present to the rest of you. What did we expect? Here are 7 boys, right from the gutters. Somehow we have had them laid on our hearts, and have enlisted to help fight the battle that is going on about them in this world. Christ died to save them, and Satan means that the sacrifice shall be in vain. He is bringing all his powers to bear on them, and he has many and varied powers. Here comes into the scene a man benevolently inclined; not a Christian, but in his way a philanthropist. By accident he has come in contact with one of the boys. By accident he learns that something, he does not know quite what, is being attempted to benefit them. Can't you give him the credit of being honest? The only thing he thinks of that he can do to help them is to give them an evening's entertainment. At one of the decent theaters there is being presented what seems to be known in their parlance as a moral play. So he presents each boy with a ticket. Now, what did we expect of those boys? Last week a lady and 2 gentlemen who have been members of our church for years left the regular prayer meeting and went to the Philharmonic concert. Ought we to expect that it would even occur to our 7 boys to give up what to them is a rare treat for the pleasure of spending an evening with us? As for the moral obligation, they have probably never so much as heard the words. Isn't it time we knew what we were about? What are we after? It is well enough to teach the poor fellows to read and write, and to help lift them up in other ways, but our efforts will amount to very little unless we succeed in bringing them to the great lever of human society. Unless Christ take hold of this thing, we shall fail. Now, has he taken hold? Is he, at least, as much interested in them as we are? Is his Holy Spirit preceding and supplementing all our efforts? And if this is the case, is an evening at a theater going to ruin his plans? Long before these earnest words were concluded, Ried had returned from his distant corner, and taken a seat near his employer. His eyes were full of tears, and his voice trembled. "I beg your pardon, Mr. Roberts. I'm an ignorant blunderer. I did feel for a moment as though everything were lost." "We have begun backwards," said Mr. Roberts. "I was reading to-day that a mistake the missionaries made for years in trying to civilize the Greenlanders, and what a perfect failure they made of it, until one day almost by accident a man began to tell them about Christ on the cross, and the story melted them. I don't think I have thought enough about him in this matter." "I stand convicted," Dr. Everett said. "I've made the same mistake, I believe, in all my efforts for people. I have been praying for them, it is true, But after all, I feel now as though there had been too much relying on human means, and not enough on God. It is a case of 'these ought ye to have done,' and not to have left the other undone." "Well," said Mr. Roberts, looking at his watch, "we are in the same condemnation. It is, I believe, the most common, and one of the most fatal, mistakes that Christian workers make. But there is a way out. We expected to spend until 10 o'clock with those boys. It is nearly 9 now. Suppose we spend the next hour with Christ, asking for the power of the Holy Spirit on any and every effort that we may make for them in the future. Our ultimate aim is to bring every one of them to Jesus, and He knows it. Now if we have gone about in the wrong way, we have only to ask Him forgiveness, and look to Him steadily for guidance. What do you say, friends? Shall we spend the hour in taking them to the only one who really can afford them lasting help? I suppose that He who 'maketh the wrath of man to praise Him' is equally able to manage the folly of man. Could the injudicious philanthropist have looked into that room that evening, and heard the prayers that went up to God for those boys, and understood something of the power of prayer, he would have had one illustration of how God manages the foolishness of men. It was a very earnest prayer meeting. These workers had each one bowed in secret, and with more or less earnestness, asked for God's blessing on their efforts. But it occurred to them that evening, as a very strange thing, that they had never unitedly prayed for this before. Therefore there was an element of confession in all the prayers that moved Gracie Dennis strangely. Especially was this the case when she heard her old acquaintance, Flossy, pour out her soul's longings. It happened, so strange are the customs of Christians, that though this was the daughter of a minister of the gospel, herself a Christian, she had never before heard a lady pray in the presence of gentlemen. She had heard of their doing so, heard them criticized with sharp sarcasm. Some of the criticisms which had sounded full of keenness and wit when she heard them, recurred to her at this time, and some way, with Flossy's low earnest voice filling her heart, they dwindled into shallowness and coarseness. All the same, their baneful influence was on her, and helped to hold her back from opening her lips, for the critic had been Professor Ellis. When the hostess and her young guest were left alone together that evening, the latter had a question to ask. "Flossy Shipley," the name you will remember which she always went back to when excited, "I didn't know you believed in praying in public. Have you changed in everything?" "In public, my dear," with a quiet smile, "why, I am in my own house." "Oh, yes, but you know what I mean. Before gentlemen. Do you really think it is necessary?" "As to that, Gracie, I don't believe I thought anything about it. I wanted to pray for those boys, and so I prayed." "And didn't you really shrink from it at all? How very queer! Flossy, I do believe nobody was ever so much changed by religion as you have been. I don't see what makes the difference. I'm sure I think I am a Christian, but I could never do such a thing as that." "Not if you believed it to be your duty?" "But I don't believe it," said the fair logician, her face flushing. "I think it is out of place. I beg your pardon, Flossy, I don't mean I think it sounded badly in you, but only that for me it would be horrid, and I couldn't do it." "Then what are you talking about, my dear? If you should never consider it your duty, you would certainly never be called upon to do it." End of chapter 19. Recording by Tricia G. Chapter 20 of Ester Ried Yet Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ester Ried Yet Speaking by Pansy. Chapter 20. Oh, what a nice thought! This very calm view of the question gave Gracie time to recover from her excitement, and to laugh at her folly. Then Mrs. Roberts said, still speaking very gently, "I don't want to argue with you, dear, and I couldn't if I wished. You know I am a dunce about all such things. But I just want to ask you a little question. You need not answer me unless you choose. Not now, that is. Perhaps sometime we may want to talk about it. I would like to know the reasons that people have for thinking that it is out of place for a lady to kneel down with her Christian friends and speak to Jesus about a thing that they unitedly desire, and that they believe He is able to do for them. If it is not proper to speak before them, why is it proper to speak to them on the same subject?" This question Gracie carried to her room for thought. Meantime, as Dr. Everett and young Ried went homeward, they had a talk together. "When I found out that those boys had gone to the theatre tonight, I was completely discouraged," declared Ried. "It seemed to me that our work was a failure. I could almost see Satan laughing over the success of his scheme. I never felt so about anything in my life. And now it seems to me that perhaps the Lord will let it result in being the best thing that ever happened to us." To all of which Dr. Everett made the apparently irrelevant answer, "Mr. Roberts and his wife are singularly well mated. How perfectly they fit into each other's thoughts. Ried, you and I have a great deal to learn from them." "I have," said Ried, meekly. Yet another bit of talk closed this evening. "McCullum has given me an idea," Mr. Roberts said to his wife as they sat together reviewing the day. "Not a bad one, I fancy. I wonder when we can act on it and watch results? There are tickets for other places besides theatres. Why couldn't we furnish them for some entertainment, lecture, or concert, or something of the sort, that would be really helpful? The only difficulty is that there are few helpful places as yet within reach of their capacities. It takes an exceptional genius to hold such listeners." But his wife, her face aglow, clasped her hands in an ecstasy of delight. "What a beautiful thought!" she said. "And how nice that it should come to you just now, when there will be such a splendid opportunity to put it in practice. Why, don't you know? Gow, next week, 50-cent tickets. On temperance, too. How grand! And, Evan, let us give them each 2 tickets. I want that Dirk Colson to take his sister. Perhaps he will not, but then he may, one can never tell. Oh, Evan, won't it be nice?" "Ah," said Mr. Roberts, "as usual you are ahead of me. I had not thought of the 2 tickets apiece. That is a suggestion for their manliness. Flossy, we'll try it." Yet another bit of talk. They shambled down the stairs from the second-rate hall at a late hour that evening, those 7 boys. Quiet for them, though the play had been exciting, and not remarkably moral viewed from the standpoint of a Christian. "After all," said Nimble Dick, breaking a silence with speech, as though the subject of which he spoke had been under discussion among them, "after all, it was rather sneaking to bolt and say nothing. I kind of wish we hadn't done it." "That's what I told you all along," said Dirk Colson, with even unusual sullenness. "But you would go and do it, and we was fools enough to follow you." "And I'll bet she had oysters or something." This from Jerry Tompkins. You have probably no idea how hungry he was at that moment. "They was goin' to do somethin' new to night. That there Dennis girl told me so when I met her on the street yesterday. Something that we would like first rate, she said, a brand new notion." This was Stephen Crowley's contribution to the general discomfort. "Well," said Nimble Dick, and the sigh with which he spoke the word would have gone to Mrs. Roberts' heart, "I s'pose it's all up now. I shouldn't wonder if we never got another bid. I wouldn't if I was them, I know that. And their old theatre wasn't no great shakes, after all. We've been a pack of fools, and I don't mind owning it." Whereupon, having reached the corner, they separated and went glumly to their homes. And this is gratitude! What a pity Mr. McCullum, who had been smiling over his benevolence all the evening, could not have heard them. The weeks that followed this night were crowded with trifles on which hung important and far-reaching results. This is a very trite saying, I know. All weeks are crowded with eventful trifles; at least, we in our blindness call them trifles, although we are constantly discovering their importance, and being constantly astonished over them. Among other things, the 7 boys became 9, having taken into their companionship 2 choice spirits, apparently worse than themselves, and appeared at the South End Mission with all the bravado that boys of their stamp are apt to put out when they feel somewhat ashamed of themselves. The consequence was that the trials which Mrs. Roberts had to endure from them, though a trifle less apparent to others, were not a whit less distressing than usual. But before the session was concluded they were treated to a sensation that held them in silent astonishment for nearly 5 minutes. Any person well acquainted with Alfred Ried could have told that he had a plan in view, and was trying to carry it in face of some opposition. He looked convinced, and Mr. Durant looked astonished and troubled. There was much low-toned talk between them and some shaking of head. Apparently, however, Mr. Ried came off victor, for his brow cleared, and he presently made his way to Mrs. Roberts' side and said a few words, and must have been gratified by the sudden lighting up of her face and her eager, "Oh, what a nice thought! Even if it fails, apparently, it will not utterly, for the suggestion will help them." In the course of time the new idea came to the front. There was to be a festival, or a social, or an entertainment at the South End in the course of a few weeks, a sort of anniversary for the starting of the mission. Among other work that was in progress, the decoration of the room, involving the hanging of pictures, banners, mottoes, wreaths, etc., required some strong arms and willing hands. Committees were to be formed. 2 weeks before, teachers had been appointed to prepare a list of committees. It fell to young Ried to appoint the committee on decoration. When he was called upon for his report, he came promptly forward, like a man ready for action, and commenced: "A committee of 4 has been deemed amply sufficient for decoration, and I appoint for the purpose the following: Richard Bolton, Morris Burns, Miss Gracie Dennis, and Miss Annie Powell." The teachers, who had been long at the mission, looked from one to another with a bewildered air. Morris Burns they knew, a clear-eyed young Scotchman, with willing hands and feet ever ready to run of errands for all workers, a boy of 19 or so whom everybody liked, warm-hearted, unselfish, and thoroughly trustworthy. Annie Powell was one of the older girls in Mr. Durant's Bible class, a sweet-faced, ladylike little factory girl, who would work in with Morris Burns nicely. Miss Gracie Dennis was Mrs. Roberts' beautiful young friend. All the teachers knew her, and all thought it very kind in her to throw her strength and taste into the preparations as heartily as though she were one of them. But who was Richard Bolton? Nobody knew. Yet their knowledge of business etiquette told them that he was chairman of the decoration committee. Where was he? Not a teacher, certainly, for they were intimately acquainted with one another, and they knew no such name in the one Bible class made up of trustworthy helpers. Over in Mrs. Roberts' class, with the single exception of the teacher, there was equal ignorance. The 9 boys had stopped their restless mischief to listen, because there is a sort of fascination to boys in all the details of well-managed business. They liked to hear the appointments, but who Richard Bolton might be seemed not to occur to one of them. It is true that Jerry Tompkins nudged Nimble Dick in anything but a quiet way with his elbow, and murmured, "You've got a namesake, it seem, in this 'ere job." Yet no light dawned on them. Mr. Durant, who, it is possible, has not appeared to you in a favorable light, for the reason that he was being much perplexed by the entirely new methods being introduced among the boys who had heretofore driven him to the very verge of desperation, was really a quick-witted man, and having succumbed to what he feared was a wild experiment, knew how to help carry it out properly. He came briskly to the front, Alfred's committee being the last on the list, and began his work. "The chairmen of these different committees will be kind enough to report to me as rapidly as possible the name and place of their first meeting for consultation, and I will make the announcements." Then he stepped to Mrs. Roberts' class. "Bolton," he said, bending toward that astonished scamp, and speaking as though this were an everyday affair, "you are chairman, I believe, of the decoration committee. Where and when will you have them meet?" Imagine Nimble Dick's eyes! Nay, imagine the eyes and faces of the entire 9! It would have been a study for an artist. For a moment Nimble Dick was speechless. Then he managed to burst forth with, "What in thunder are you talking about?" "Your committee," said Mr. Durant, politely ignoring the manner of the questioner. "You must call them together, you know, to plan your work. Where shall it be, and when?" "I ain't got no committee, and I ain't got no place to meet nobody, and I don't know what in thunder you're after." Then came Mrs. Roberts to the rescue. "Why, Mr. Bolton, you can meet at our society parlor, you know. It is the very place, and will be so convenient for Miss Dennis." "What's to meet, and what's to do?" said Dick defiantly. "I ain't going to meet nobody." "Why, it is just to hang mottoes and banners, and trim the room for the anniversary. Of course you'll help. I would have the meeting arranged there, by all means." "Very well," said Mr. Durant quickly, as though he had received the answer from the chairman himself. Now as to time, you ought to come together tomorrow evening if you could. There is a good deal to do." "Mr. Bolton, couldn't you come up at 6 o'clock for once? Then you could get your work all done before the time for our social. I can arrange for Annie Powell to be there at that time. And Mr. Durant, doesn't Morris Burns work for you? Could he be present at 6 o'clock? Then I don't see but your meeting is nicely planned. You can be there at 6, can't you, Mr. Bolton?" "I tell you I don't know nothin' what you are talking about." Nimble Dick, who was rarely anything but good-natured, was surprised by the bewilderments of the situation into being almost as fierce as Dirk Colson was habitually. The gaping amazement of his boon companions seemed to add to his irritation. "But you will," said the teacher cheerily. "It is an easy matter to explain. Miss Dennis knows all about such things, and I'm going to help, though they haven't honored me with an appointment." At a sign from the lady, Mr. Durant stepped back to the platform and announced: "The chairman of the Committee on Decoration desires me to say that his committee is called together tomorrow evening at the Young Men's Social Parlors, No. 76 East 55th Street, at 6 o'clock sharp, as the chairman has another engagement at 7. "I had to coin a name for the place of meeting," he said to Mrs. Roberts afterwards. "I beg your pardon if it was wrong; but Ried has been giving me glowing accounts of that room, and you said something about its being a social parlor, didn't you?" "It is a good name," said Mrs. Roberts. "We have awkwardly called it the New Room. I am glad it is christened. I will have some curtains hung through the center tomorrow, to make parlors instead of parlor out of it. I can see how a second room can be made useful in several ways." Thus was the bewildering committee willed into existence, the chairman thereof being still so dumbfounded with his position that he did not rouse until the laughing boys, by whom he was surrounded, began to take in some of the fun of the situation, and to assault him right and left with mock congratulations, ill-suppressed groans, hisses, and the like. Then he turned towards them with new-born dignity that would have fitted Dirk Colson, and he said: "If you fellows don't shut up and behave yourselves something like decent for the rest of the time, I'll chaw half a dozen of you into mincemeat as soon as we are out of this." Chapter 21 of Ester Ried Yet Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ester Ried Yet Speaking by Pansy. Chapter 21. Had his experiment been too severe? Dr. Everett was driving rapidly through the city, at least as rapidly as the crowded character of the street would permit. He was out on professional duty, and had just been congratulating himself that his regular calls were now made for the day, and unless something special intervened, he should have a couple of hours free for the alleys. That meant professional duty, too, and of a very hardest character, one would suppose, as it brought him in contact not only with sickness in some of its most repulsive forms, but with abject poverty as well, and too often with loathsome forms of sin. Yet he went about his work with a zest that his regular practice did not furnish. This was something done solely for Jesus' sake, and with an eye that was manifestly single to his glory. He had already selected his alley, and was planning how, when his horses were safely stabled, he could make a cross-cut to it, when his eyes were held by two persons who were ascending together the stairway that led to one of the public halls. His face darkened as he watched them. Apparently they were engrossed with each other, and took no notice of him, but there were reasons why he specially desired to keep them in view. A network of carriages and wagons, such as is common to crowded thoroughfares, blocked his path just then, and prolonged his opportunity to watch the two. They made their way in a very leisurely manner up the long staircase, letting others, more in haste, pass them continually. Yet presently they joined the group who were passing up tickets of entrance. The doctor signaled a policeman, and entered into conversation. "What is going on in Seltzer Hall?" "Well, sir, there's a kind of a concert, I guess. They play on goblets, they say, just common glass goblets, and make fine music." "An afternoon entertainment?" "Yes, sir, as a kind of introduction, you know. They expect to get a crowd for evening by the means." "Do you know where tickets are to be had?" The policeman indicated a bookstore at his left by a gesture from his thumb, and said, "Right here," and offered to secure some at once. He knew of Dr. Everett, many of the policemen did. His offer was accepted with thanks, and the doctor presently wound his way out from the network with 2 green tickets in his pocket. His plans for the afternoon had been suddenly changed. Instead of spending the time in Sewell Alley, he had decided to attend a musical exhibition, the instruments being goblets! He must make all speed now, so he left the crowded street and dodged through several byways to the stables. No use to keep his horses. She would be afraid to drive through such crowds, he explained to himself, and I should be afraid to leave the carriage standing. Rushing out from the stables, he caught just the right street car, and in a short space of time was ringing at Mr. Roberts' door. Gracie Dennis was in the hall, dressed for the street. "Ah," said the doctor, "I am either fortunate or unfortunate, I wonder which. I had set my heart on having you for a companion to what I fancy may be a unique entertainment. Is there another engagement in the way? I know this is a most unconventional method, but a doctor is never sure of his time." But Gracie Dennis felt too well acquainted with Dr. Everett, and was too young and ready for enjoyment to be disturbed about conventionality. She merrily declared her willingness to be taken to whatever entertainment the doctor had to propose. Mrs. Roberts was out with her husband on business connected with church matters, and she had only intended to walk a square or 2 for her health. On the way the doctor was distrait, Gracie having most of the talking to do herself. The truth was, he was trying to recall the faces of the people he had seen crowding into the hall, to make sure that he was not taking Gracie among people whom he would not care to have her meet. Apparently the couple whose movements had changed all his afternoon plans were not a sufficient guarantee of respectability. However, his face cleared as he recalled one and another as being in the crowd seeking admission. They might not be of the class with whom Gracie was accustomed to mingle, but they were respectable people. Gracie was in a merry mood. She understood enough of the doctor's busy life to feel sure that this sudden resolve to be entertained was quite out of his ordinary line, and that of itself served to mark the hour as exceptional. "He feels the need of a little everyday fun," she told herself, "and I'll help him to have it if I can. Poor man, it must be doleful to go among sick and dying people all the time." They were late at the hall. The concert was well under way, but there were plenty of vacant seats. Dr. Everett swept his eye over the room, then indicated to the usher just which seat he would have. It was one which commanded a view of the young man and woman who seemed to have such a mysterious influence over his plans. He was relieved to find quite early in the entertainment that it really was unique, and, in its way, well worth hearing. Had the surroundings been agreeable, he could easily have given himself up to enjoyment. However, they had been seated but a few moments, when he saw by Gracie's startled eyes that she had seen and recognized at least one of the couple at their left. Professor Ellis, in his usual faultless attire, lounged gracefully on the seat in such a manner that his side face was distinct. He rested a well-shaped arm on the back of the seat next him, and his delicately gloved hand almost, if not quite, touched the shoulder of his companion. Both he and the lady at his side gave extremely little attention to the entertainment in progress. Apparently they had come thither for purposes of conversation. They kept up a continuous murmur of talk, interspersed at intervals with rippling laughter, and really seemed so entirely absorbed in each other as to have at times forgotten that the hall was public, and that the attention of many was being turned toward them. The girl was pretty, extremely so, with an entirely different style of beauty from Gracie Dennis, and a certain indescribable something in her face and manner would have told even the most casual observer that she moved in a different circle. It was not her dress, unless that was a little too pronounced for the place and hour, but quite young ladies in good society sometimes make a similar mistake. Neither was her manner objectionable to the degree that you could have pointed to any one thing as offensive. Yet you would have been sure, had you watched her, that she was out of the pale of what we call society. Gracie Dennis watched her with a kind of fascination, becoming at last so absorbed with the watching, and the apparently troubled thoughts which grew out of it, that she gave but slight attention to Dr. Everett's occasional remarks, nor seemed to observe that at last he lapsed into total silence. Once during the hour the young woman glanced casually in their direction, and the careless nod and free and easy smile which she acknowledged Dr. Everett's presence, drew a startled glance from Gracie to rest on him for a moment. "Now I wish I had my horses," the doctor said, as at last they made their way down the aisle. "I have a mile's drive up town to take, and I think the exercise might be good for you." Gracie caught at the suggestion, and begged to be allowed to remain in the bookstore below while he went for the horses. "I want a ride, and I want to talk with you," she said simply. As this was precisely what he wanted, he went for the horses without more delay. Meantime Gracie, in one of the windows of the bookstore, was supposed to be employed in examining a late book, but in reality gave much attention to the couple who were crossing the street, or rather waiting for the opportunity to do so. They seemed in no haste, but were conspicuous, even in the crowded street, for their interest in each other. More than one policeman regarded them narrowly, as Professor Ellis stood with head bent toward the lady, engaged in eager and animated conversation. It was just the attitude of absorbed interest with which he had so often listened to Gracie, not on the street, it is true, but in some crowded parlor, and it had flattered her. It made her frown today. They were starting now to make the disagreeable crossing. He had taken his companion's hand, preparatory to a leap over a muddy curbing; but Gracie could see that there was a pressure of it that was unnecessary, and, for the street, peculiar. His face, too, was distinctly visible, and the expression on it was what Gracie had seen before, but certainly she supposed no other person had. Altogether, it was probably well for Professor Ellis's peace of mind that he did not turn at that moment and get a glimpse of the young lady in the bookstore. Instead, he took his lady away, and they were lost in the crowd. Dr. Everett, making all haste with his horses, had still time for anxious thought. Had his experiment been too severe on Gracie? Was it possible that her interest in the man was such that this afternoon's experience had been mixed with pain as well as with disgust? He could not believe it possible that the pure-hearted young girl cared for such a man as Professor Ellis. Yet there had been a look on her face when she saw those two which startled and hurt him. When fairly seated in his carriage, he did not speak until they had threaded the maze of wagons and reached clear ground. Even then he only said, "Now for speed," and gave the horses their desire, until crowds and business were left behind, and they were driving down a broad avenue, lined on either side with stately yet quiet-looking homes. Then he drew rein and obliged the horses to walk. He had by this time resolved on probing the wound, if there was one. "I wish I knew just how much of a villain that man is." These were the somewhat startling words which broke his silence. What man? Yet the very tones of Gracie's voice indicated that she knew of whom he was speaking. "That man Ellis. Professor, I think he is called. I have reason to be very suspicious of him. By the way, Miss Gracie, I think he is an acquaintance of yours. Have you confidence in him?" How promptly and indignantly such a question would have received an affirmative answer 2 months before! What should she say now? "In what respect?" She faltered, more for the purpose of gaining time than because she did not understand the question. "Well, in any respect I am almost prepared to say. I have not the honor of the man's acquaintance, but whatever I hear about him or see in him, I dislike and distrust. Just at present his ways are specially disturbing. You noticed him this afternoon, I think. The young girl in his company belongs to my Sabbath school. I have a deep interest in her, partly because she is the sort of girl who is always more or less in danger in this wicked world, and partly because she is capable of strongly influencing another, who is a special protégée of mine." "Who is the girl?" Gracie's manner was abrupt, and her voice constrained. It was evident that she was making a great effort to control herself, and appear indifferent to all parties. The doctor took no notice of her constraint. "Her name is Mason, Hester Mason. She attends the Packard Place Sabbath School, which you know I superintend. She is motherless, and worse than fatherless, is a clerk in one of the Fourth Avenue stores, and is, or was, inclined to be what is called gay. I do not know that that term conveys any special meaning to you. In young men I think they call the same line of conduct fast. I hope and believe that you would not well understand either term, yet I think, possibly, that watching her this afternoon in a public hall will give you some conception of the stretch that there is between yourself and her. End of chapter 21. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 22 of Ester Ried Yet Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ester Ried Yet Speaking by Pansy. Chapter 22. Some People Are Hard to Warn. Had Dr. Everett desired in a few words to show Gracie the gulf between herself and the man who had been the girl's companion for the afternoon, perhaps he could not have formed his sentence better. She shivered visibly, and the doctor drew the carriage wraps more carefully about her, while he continued: I would not want to give you a wrong estimate of Hester Mason, nor lead you to imagine for a moment that I believe a girl who serves behind a counter cannot be a true lady. I wanted, rather, to explain to you that her opportunities had been limited. She means to be a good girl, I think. In fact, I may say I have the utmost confidence in her intentions. She is not a Christian, but a few weeks ago I had her name on my notebook as one who was almost persuaded. She has been fighting the question of personal religion for some time, her special stumbling block being that she is quick-witted, and has quite a clear idea of how Christians ought to live, and can find very few who seem to her to be living what they profess. However, as I say, I have been very hopeful of her until within a few weeks, when she came in contact with this man, and I tremble for the result. He is constant in his attentions, and she is evidently flattered and dazed. How long has he known her? How did he become acquainted? Abrupt question still, asked in that curiously repressed voice. The doctor's face was growing very grave and stern. He feared that there was a real wound here. Inadvertently, Miss Dennis. It seems that both you and I are to blame, or at least are involved in the acquaintance. Do you remember a little incident which occurred in a street car some 6 weeks ago? A young woman, in leaving the car, dropped a package, which you, noticing, called our attention to, and pointed out the person crossing the street, and Professor Ellis announced his willingness to overtake her and return the package, as he was about to leave the car. Miss Mason was the person in question, and Professor Ellis presumed on that very slight introduction to cultivate an acquaintance. I have learned that he quoted my name in connection with the incident, and since that day has been on terms of exceeding intimacy with Hester. Gracie was surprised out of her reserve. I remember the incident perfectly, but the girl I saw this afternoon cannot be the one who was on the car. Yes, she was in holiday attire today, and in her working garb when you saw her momentarily on the car. I remember a feeling of regret that Professor Ellis should have so promptly volunteered to do your errand. Yet I did not know what I dreaded. I simply shrank from the man, and wanted others to do so. Dr. Everett, what is his motive in showing her attention? I wish I knew. I can tell you what I greatly fear, that it is to play with the human heart, to see to what extent he can gain power over it. And in this case certainly it is a most cruel thing. The girl has no friends, no father or mother to advise with or help her. She is bright and pretty, and is being shown glimpses of a world that seems to her like fairyland. She is dazzled, and one cannot blame her, for she has neither carefully formed judgment nor trustworthy friends to lean upon. Miss Dennis, you can judge from her manner this afternoon what is her knowledge of the customs of polite society. I do not think she has an idea that she was conspicuous, save for her beauty and the fine appearance of her attendant. She is not one to shrink from what we would consider legitimate public admiration, and this you can see but adds to her danger. But Dr. Everett, you do not think, you cannot mean that he intends to pay her special attention, that he means anything beyond the desire to give her a little pleasure? "Well," said the doctor, speaking slowly but with firmness, "you may judge, Miss Dennis, what I think, what any honorable person thinks, of a man who bestows in public the sort of attentions which we saw this afternoon. You would have been insulted by them. The only reason that this poor girl was not, is because she does not know any better." "Did you observe the flashing of a peculiarly set ring on her finger? I have reason to fear that it belongs to him, and that she believes herself specially honored in being asked to wear it." Poor Gracie's cheeks were flaming now. She had not observed the ring, but she knew it well, and for one brief evening had worn it herself, and then had returned it to the owner with the assurance that she could not bring herself to wear it without her father's consent. She remembered what a wound she had felt herself bestowing when he had looked at her with those expressive, reproachful eyes, and replied that if she felt toward him as he did to her, she would not allow even a father to come between them. And he had actually given that ring into the keeping of this girl! They rode on in silence, the doctor giving a hint to the horses that they might go as fast as they chose. He was in great doubt and pain of heart. Could it be possible that this carefully shielded young girl was caught in the toils of a man whom he believed to be an unprincipled villain? If so, had he been unnecessarily cruel in his revelations? Ought he to take her home, or drive further, and give her time to recover herself? Could he have understood what was passing in her mind, he would have known better what next to say. The simple truth was this: before she came to Mrs. Roberts, the child had believed herself to be a martyr to the unreasonable prejudices of her stepmother. She had been led to feel that her father had turned against her, solely because of his wife's influence over him, and that the wife was piqued because Professor Ellis had not paid her sufficient attention in the days of her maidenhood. This, the professor had succeeded in teaching Gracie to feel, was the sole charge against him. He was, therefore, an ill-used man, and therefore her heart went out towards him in sympathy. It had not been at first a stronger feeling than this, but flattered by his attentions, so much more marked and polished than had ever been offered to the young girl before, she had taught herself to believe that, but for her father's bitterness, she could be to Professor Ellis what he delicately and vaguely assured her no one else could, and fill a place that hitherto in his lonely life had been left void. She had not engaged herself to him, indeed he had never in actual words asked her to do so, but to the young and innocent and well-trained there is a language which speaks as clearly as words, and is held as sacred. Gracie had allowed herself to be looked upon as one who was held by others from being more to Professor Ellis than she was; who might always, perhaps, be held back, for she had resolved in her own sad heart that she would never marry against her father's consent, no, not if she were twice of age. Of late, strange reflections had come to her. She had measured Professor Ellis with other men, Christian men, and he had appeared at a disadvantage. Also she had measured herself by the side of other Christian workers, and herself had appeared at a disadvantage. A vague unrest and dissatisfaction with her Christian experience were growing on her. Moreover, she was growing interested in those boys, as she had not believed that it would be possible for her to be interested when she first saw them. She began to believe that some of them, at least, would be saved. She wanted to help save them, and to help others. Her martyrdom dwindled rapidly into insignificance, until there would pass entire days in which she did not once remember that she was an unhappy girl. At last, but a week or two before this afternoon, she had taken her affairs in hand, and tried to look steadily at them. The result of her hours of thought and prayer was that she was bound to Professor Ellis. That is, provided there should come a time in the dim and distant future when her father should give his consent, it would be her duty and her pleasure, because of what had passed between them, to marry him. Still, she began to feel less amazed at her father's opinion of him, less angry about it. She began to say to herself, softly and pitifully, "Poor lonely man! He has no one to be his friend. He is not a Christian, and that is what makes so great a difference between him and others. It is that which papa misses, but I must not desert him. I must pray for him all the time, and work for his conversion. Then he will grow to be the sort of man whom papa can like, and everything will be all right." And while she said it, she was dimly conscious of a feeling of satisfaction over the thought that she was very young, and that it would be a long, long time yet before anything could be settled, and that, meantime, it certainly was not right for her to have anything to do with Professor Ellis, only to pray for him, and that perhaps her father would allow her to carry out a project that was under delightful discussion in the Roberts family, namely, to remain in the city as a pupil in the famous Green Lawn School. And she did not know, foolish little thing, that so far even as her heart was concerned, everything was wrong. Perhaps it would be difficult for me to explain to you, that is, if you do not understand without explanation, what a turmoil she was thrown into by this afternoon's experience. She was far from realizing as yet that the uppermost feeling even now was not wounded love, but wounded pride. Of what poor stuff she had been making a hero! Nothing had ever opened her eyes like this before. Was it possible that she had spent entire evenings with a man who stooped to set in unpleasant, even suspicious light, not his own character only, but that of an ignorant young girl? It would not do to plead a lack of knowledge in excuse for him. He might be ignorant of the ways of the Christian world, but no one understood better the rules which govern society. During part of the afternoon she had been very angry with the girl, but after listening to Dr. Everett it began to dawn upon her that her friend had been playing with the ignorance of a girl who probably trusted him fully. You are to understand that Gracie Dennis was the sort of girl who would be made very angry by such a suspicion. The glow on her cheeks was not all caused by the fresh air of the spring day. "Dr. Everett," she said at last, breaking the silence, "what do you think he means by asking the girl to wear that ring, or by letting her wear it? Do you suppose that he has engaged himself to her?" "I wish I knew what he meant," Dr. Everett said again, a surge of indignation rushing over him. "If he really meant anything so honorable as that, it would be bad enough business for poor Hester. But, as I said, I distrust the man utterly, and from my experience with the world I have reason. From your knowledge of him, Miss Dennis, could you suppose him to be honest and earnest in his attentions to that girl?" It was a very plain question. It meant more to Dr. Everett than even Gracie saw, but she saw enough to know that she was admitting an intimacy that made her blush. However, she answered steadily: "No, I cannot think that he is honest or honorable." "So I fear. Witness this afternoon. Gentlemen do not parade their friendships before the public gaze, and that man knows it." The doctor's voice was very stern. He was sure now that there was a wound, and that it was being probed. He believed in making thorough work, even with wounds. There would be more hope of a genuine healing afterward. Gracie's next question, if her companion had but known it, was a singular one. Why have not people who are her friends warned her against him, and held her back from making such a false step, if she does it in ignorance? Oh, Gracie Dennis! How are warnings sometimes received, even by carefully trained girls, who have every reason to trust the love that would shield them? "Some people are very hard to warn," said the doctor. "I have tried it, and I have a friend who has tried to help her; but the poor girl, you must remember, has not been brought up in a Christian atmosphere, has never had a Christian friend who came with the authority of relationship. If she had a good father, the way would be made so plain. As it is, can't you see how naturally she distrusts the rest of us, in favor of the man who makes special professions of friendship? I am not surprised at Hester, I am only sorry for her." Had the doctor been carefully informed as to all the circumstances connected with Gracie's intimacy with the professor, he could not have chosen words which would have touched her conscience more. Had not her good father tenderly and patiently warned her? And had she not chosen to blind her eyes to all his words, and believe rather in Professor Ellis than in him? End of chapter 22. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 23 of Ester Ried Yet Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ester Ried Yet Speaking by Pansy, Chapter 23, Part of the Great Well-to-Do World. "I must call at this house," the doctor said, suddenly drawing rein before a quiet little house at the foot of a wide lawn. "The gatekeeper of this American castle has a sick child whom I have promised to see. Can you hold the horses, Miss Dennis, or shall I tie them? This is a quiet spot, and they are gentle." "I am not afraid of anything," Gracie said, eyes aglow as well as cheeks. And the doctor went into the house wondering whether Professor Ellis, if he could see her now, would not be afraid of her. Once inside he gave a start of surprise, almost of dismay, for the face which appeared at the open door of the sick room belonged to Joy Saunders. "You here?" he said, trying to control the disturbed element in his voice. She answered quietly, "I came out by street car. Did you drive?" "Yes," he said abruptly, "but I am not alone. How is the child?" And he went forward at once to his professional duties, leaving her to wonder over his manner. It was peculiar, certainly. Joy Saunders was used to abruptness from this man, but there was a quality in it today that she did not recognize. She went and looked out of the window, and saw Gracie Dennis holding the horses, saw her red, red cheeks and flashing eyes, and the peculiar haughty poise of her head, with which the stepmother at home was well acquainted. She did not know this Gracie Dennis, save by reputation. Once Dr. Everett had asked her to call at Mrs. Roberts', and had made her feel as though she were foolishly conventional in declining to do so. "How is she ever to know you according to the rules which trammel society? There ought to be some way arranged for Christians to be free from trammels." This had been his comment, but he had not asked her again, and she had never met Mrs. Roberts, nor yet Gracie Dennis. Yet she knew her very well, and had watched her often as she passed. She knew instantly who she was now, as she sat there in her haughty beauty, checking with determined hand the impatience of those horses. Oh, she knew more than this. It was very apparent now why Dr. Everett was peculiarly abrupt, and, well, yes, embarrassed. She had almost thought that was the name of the feeling, only it had seemed so absurd. And then Joy Saunders held her meek little head high, and told herself that he need not fear her presence. She could go as she had come, in the street car. The doctor came towards her now, speaking rapidly as usual. "Joy, the child is very sick. There ought to be an experienced person here to-night. Not you. I am sorry you came up. Do you think your mother would come? Will you ride down with me? I have Miss Dennis in the carriage, but it is quite large enough for 3, you know." Then Joy had turned away her head, holding it high, and said, "No, thank you, I am going down in the street car." And that blundering doctor drew on his gloves, saying to himself, "I don't know but that is best," and went out, only waiting to say to Joy, "Will you ask your mother about it? I will see her as soon as I can get around. I wish you would go directly home from here, will you?" Then he lifted his hat to her, and sprang into his carriage and rode away with Gracie Dennis, and Joy Saunders waited for the next yellow car, and climbed into it, and told herself all the way downtown that she wished she had stayed at the little house, and watched all night by the sick child. The thoughts that Dr. Everett had given to the entire matter were few. They ran somewhat after this fashion: "Joy here, and I'm afraid of the fever, from all I've heard. I shall take her home as soon as possible. How will that poor little girl in the carriage manage, with a new acquaintance just now, I wonder? I am afraid it will be quite a strain. Still, I can do the talking, and let her be quiet. The main point is that I hoped she might have a suggestion to make about Hester. If she could rouse herself to try to save that girl, it would be the best thing she could do. If she only knew it, Joy is the one who could help her in that direction, or any other." As they dashed down the avenue, he was still occupied in wishing that he had urged Joy to ride, and thus forced an acquaintance between her and the pretty girl at his side. He was not very patient with what he called the trammels of society. When there were two people so fitted to enjoy and help one another, as were Joy Saunders and Gracie Dennis, he held it to be a waste in Christian economy that they should not know each other. Too much occupied with his thoughts and his driving to give heed to passers-by, he lost the careful bow that young Ried had for him as they drew near the city's whirl again. Gracie did not; she returned it with a slightly heightened color in her cheeks, and wondered if that young man knew Professor Ellis, and what he thought of him, and what he thought of her for being acquainted with him. Sometimes it seems to me a real pity that on occasion there could not be some way of looking into one another's thoughts. So many misunderstandings might thus be saved. For instance, there was Ried, who went on his way with a clouded brow. Where had Dr. Everett been? And why was Gracie Dennis with him? Was it probable that he had been riding for pleasure? The bare suggestion astonished the young man. He found that he had never before given room to the thought that Dr. Everett took time for pleasure. Allowing this to be the case, why had he not taken Joy Saunders with him? Such a proceeding would have seemed altogether natural, though the honest-hearted young fellow admitted to himself that, had he been taking a ride for pleasure, the companion of his choice would not have been Joy Saunders. It was certainly a bewildering world. So trying did young Ried find his thoughts on that evening that he actually set himself deliberately to learn whether the ride was the result of chance or design. The consequence was that he learned not only of the ride, but of the afternoon entertainment at Seltzer Hall, with glass goblets for instruments. This increased his astonishment, and did not lessen the gloom on his face. But the two in the carriage, unconscious of the gloomy young man, or of the sad-hearted young girl riding in a street car, were almost silent during the homeward ride, until just as they turned into the avenue that led to Mr. Roberts' door. Then Gracie said: "Dr. Everett, I should like to know that girl. There are some things that I ought to say to her, and if I had a chance I would try to say them in a way to help her." "I will manage it," said Dr. Everett, speaking in a quick, relieved tone. He felt encouraged for Hester now, and greatly relieved about Gracie. She might be wounded, but she was made of the material of which he had hoped. She was not going to die herself, nor fold her hands and see others ruined, merely because she had been deceived. He bade her a cheery good afternoon, and drove away, feeling that, although he had been obliged to give up Sewell Alley, good work had been accomplished. He believed now that he understood the situation. He was right about one thing. Gracie Dennis had not the slightest idea of dying. Her mood was better expressed, half an hour later, when she stood at the parlor window, and returned a low, lingering bow from Professor Ellis, with a haughty stare from flashing eyes, looking out from an erect and motionless head. Dirk Colson's brain was in a whirl. He had an important question to settle. In his pocket were 2 blue tickets, promising to admit him to the largest and finest hall in the city to hear the great temperance orator. Dirk knew very little about orators, but he had heard of John B. Gough, and everything he had heard made him wish to have a glimpse of him. You will remember that Dirk was an imitator. He had heard that Mr. Gough was also, and deep down in his heart the boy had an ambition to hear the man. Now was his unexpected opportunity. Of course he was going, but the perplexing thing was, what to do with that other ticket. There was Mart? Oh yes, to be sure, he had not forgotten her. But what a strange thing it would be to take her to a lecture! He had never taken her anywhere in his life. She had nothing to wear, though he remembered at that moment that the mother had, by earnest effort, succeeded in getting her shawl out of pawn. There was one incentive for taking her: it would please Mrs. Roberts. Dirk studied the thing for some time, to try to discover why she should care, and had finally given up the problem as too great for him. Yet he was sure she cared. There had been a wistful light in her eyes when she said, "I thought possibly you might like to take that sister with the golden hair," that he saw and interpreted. It took him 3 days to decide what he should say, supposing he made up his mind to ask her. Several people were at work helping him, though he knew nothing about that. Mrs. Roberts remarked one evening to young Ried that she wished she knew a way to induce Dirk Colson to take his sister, without actually asking him to do so. She fancied that, besides the advantage which might possibly directly follow an evening spent in that way, it would suggest new thoughts to the brother. The young man caught at the suggestion, and wanted to help carry it out. It was not an easy thing to do. He had not grown intimate with Dirk Colson. In fact, that misguided young fellow rather resented any attempt at intimacy. He was, however, acquainted with Sallie Calkins. The numerous trips he had made to their room during Mark's illness had brought him into such constant and pleasant contact with Sallie and her brother that they looked upon him as a tried friend. Sallie, he knew, was a friend of the shy, golden-haired sister. So one evening he went to call at the Calkins room, with a vague hope of helping indirectly in bringing to pass Mrs. Roberts' desires. To Sallie he made known the wish that Dirk would take his sister to the lecture, and secured from her a promise to help the scheme along, provided it developed. After he went away, Sallie sat long at her sewing, making all alone, by a dim light, one of the most heroic little sacrifices that was ever offered "in His name." To fully understand it, you must know that Mark Calkins had recovered sufficiently to take his place in the office where Dr. Everett had secured him an opening, and an employment that would enable him to sit most of the time, thereby giving his injured limb a chance to rest. Also, Mark had been admitted to the Monday evening gatherings, and was distinguishing himself there by his skill in reading and writing. Of course he had received 2 tickets, and equally of course, being the boy he was, he had planned to take Sallie with him to the lecture. Great was Sallie's prospective pleasure. The event of her lifetime it was to be. To walk with Mark through the crowded streets, both neatly dressed, to walk boldly forward with the throng, and present their tickets of admittance to the great hall, hitherto seen only from the outside; to move down the long aisles as those who had a right, and select their seats unquestioned by police; in short, to be like other people, part of the great well-to-do world, this was Sallie's joy. She had washed and mended her best calico dress; she had sewed buttons on the pretty cape, according to Mrs. Roberts' directions; she had tried on the neat bonnet which had been manufactured for her by Mrs. Roberts' own fingers, and, altogether, Sallie had probably gotten, during those 2 days, more enjoyment out of Gough's lecture than many others, who had heard him a dozen times, ever secured. I do not think it any wonder that, as she rocked and sewed, and thought out her great thought, there fell tears on the work she was doing. Chapter 24 of Ester Ried Yet Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ester Ried Yet Speaking by Pansy, Chapter 24, For You Don't Know What May Come. This was the thought. Suppose Dirk Colson should want to take his sister. Sallie did not believe it in the least probable; she had not that amount of faith in Dirk Colson. But suppose he should, Mart should not go, for the reason that she would have nothing to wear. And here was Sallie's pretty cape, which would cover the worst of her dress, and her pretty bonnet, which she knew would make a picture of Mart. But if she lent them it meant staying at home to Sallie. Could she do it? Could she bear to think of such a thing? What would Mark say? What would he do with his other ticket? Would she be likely ever to have another chance to go to that wonderful hall and be like other folks? But Mart had never been anywhere in her life. "And I," said poor Sallie, catching her breath with a sob, "have been often for a walk on the brightest streets, and looked in at the shop windows, and everything. I most know I will help her to go if I can." Young Ried had no conception of the sacrifice for which he had asked. It is little wonder, surely, that Sallie's voice faltered that same evening, as she explained to Mart, who had slipped in for a bit of talk, that if ever she wanted to go anywhere very bad, she was to let Sallie know, and she should have her cape and bonnet to wear. Then she had anxiously planned for her a way to mend her dress, so that it would look quite well under the cape, and she had even urged, "Now do, Mart, if anybody should want you to go, don't say you won't, but take your chance, for you don't know what may come." Also she bore with patience Mart's scornful laugh, and emphatic statement that no chances ever came to her, and nobody ever wanted her to go anywhere. As she talked she grew interested and eloquent, urged earnestly that Mart should embrace the first opportunity to go somewhere, and wear her new cape and bonnet. At the same time she was silent about the lecture. Suppose no chance should come! Then it would be doubly hard to Mart to have had the possibility suggested. The same delicate reasoning had held her from dwelling on her own prospects. Some people would have been very much astonished over the amount of delicate consideration for the feelings of others which could be found in that little room. Dirk loitered strangely over his meager dinner the next afternoon. It was late, for he had secured a position at last in one of the printing offices, and was apt to take his meals at any hour when it happened to be convenient to do without him at the office. He had only been 3 days at work, and Mart had taken little notice of the new departure, except to remark grimly that it would not last. But to Sallie she had boasted that Dirk had gone to work as hard as anybody. If somebody could have only told Dirk that his sister ever boasted of him, it might have helped him much during these days. "What are you hanging around for? You've got all there will be to eat in this house to-day, and it is time you were off." This was the ungracious manner in which the sister took note of his lingering. She was painfully afraid that he had already grown weary of regular employment, and the fear made her voice gruffer than usual. His reply amazed her; in fact, it amazed himself. "Mart, I've got tickets to a show, a nice place, and I want you to go along." "Humph!" said Mart, "that's a likely story." Then he grew earnest, displayed his treasures, and urged her acceptance, quite astonished with himself the while. Did he really want her to go, he wondered, or did he want to please Mrs. Roberts? You would have been interested an hour later to have seen Mart skip up the rickety stairs leading to the Calkins abode. You would probably have thought that she endangered life or limb by her rapid movements. But Mart was used to such staircases, and the news she had to communicate required haste. "There's a chance!" she said, breathless with speed and eagerness. "Sallie Calkins, there's a chance, and you'd never guess how. Dirk, he wants me to go to a show with him this very night. He's got tickets. It is a big show, where all the grand folks go. It is in the very biggest hall in the city, and Dirk says I am to go. Sallie Calkins, do you mean it truly that I am to wear your lovely new bonnet and cape? Do you suppose I can really go anywhere? I don't know why Dirk wants me to so bad, but he coaxed and coaxed." Poor Sallie! She stooped quickly to pick up a pin from the floor, so that Mart might not get a glimpse of her eyes with the sudden tears in them. Yet, as she stooped, she made her final, grand sacrifice. Mart should go. Then she entered with entire abandon into the preparations. Not only her bonnet and cape, but her shoes, new ones that Mark had bought her with his first earnings after his illness, were to attend the lecture. She rejoiced over the excellent fit of the shoes. She did more than this. As Mart watched the process of buttoning them, and remarked complacently that she shouldn't wonder if Dirk would buy her a pair some day, when he earned money enough, she kept her lip from curling with an incredulous sneer. You will remember that she had not the slightest faith in Dirk. Neither must I forget that there was another thing to lend, her comb, in order that Mart's wonderful yellow hair might be for once reduced to something like order. And at the risk of leading you to think that Sallie was altogether too aesthetic for her position in life, I shall have to confess that this was her hardest bit of sacrifice. Her comb was so new and so pretty. However, it did its duty on Mart's tawny locks, and the transforming effect was marvelous. In fact, when all was ready, the cape adjusted, the hat which Mrs. Roberts had shown her how to wear set on the yellow head, Sallie said not a word, but went to the packing box in the corner, which served as a treasure cupboard, and drew forth the one possession about which she had been utterly silent, a little hand glass which Mark had bought her one winter evening, just before he was hurt. A cheap, little, ugly glass, which you would have turned from in disgust, saying that it made your nose awry, and your chin protrude, and your eyes squint, and was altogether horrid. But, held before Mart's glowing face, what a secret did it reveal! Mart looked and was silent too, and went home in a hushed frame of mind to wait for Dirk. Home was deserted. The mother had dragged her wearied body out for a day of "light work." The time had gone by when she was able to do any that people called heavy. Where the father was, none of the family knew, and their chief hope concerning him was that he would stay away as long as possible. I find myself longing to give you an idea of what that elegant, brilliantly lighted hall, with its brilliant audience, was to this girl, and being unable to do it. When people live so far below us that our everyday experiences are to them like a day at the World's Fair, it is very hard indeed to describe how our special treats affect them. It was a treat to everybody to hear Gow. How then can I tell you what it was to this girl and her brother? Dirk listened, he must have listened well, for long afterward he was able to repeat entire paragraphs, and to imitate the manner of the great orator with remarkable skill. Yet at the time he would have seemed to a close watcher to have been absorbed in another way. He looked at Mart somewhat as he had on that Sabbath when his acquaintance with Mrs. Roberts began. But the thought which had dimly haunted him that day blossomed on this evening. Certainly Mart looked like Mrs. Roberts. It might be folly to think so, doubtless the fellows would make no end of fun of him if he should ever tell them so, which he meant to take excellent care not to do, but the fact remained, that in Sally's bonnet and cape, and above all, with the waves of hair floating about her, there was a look which instantly and strongly reminded him of that lady. There was another listener at the lecture who was unexpectedly present. Part of poor Sally's trial had been to tell her brother, who had been radiant for a week over the prospect of taking her, that she had with her own hand put away the blessing. How would Mark take it? Dirk's forlorn-looking sister was no favorite of his. I think it would have been very difficult to have convinced him that there was a trace of Mrs. Roberts in her face. But such curious creatures are we that it actually hurt Sally to see how quietly he took the great sad news of her sacrifice. After the first start of surprise, he seemed preoccupied, and she could almost have thought that he did not hear her explanation. She had much ado to keep back the tears, but she had made a special little feast for him that evening, with a white cloth on the table, and a cup of actual tea, and the cup set in a saucer. She was not going to spoil the scene with tears, so after a little she said, cheerily, "Now you have the chance to do something nice for somebody. Who will you take on your ticket?" "I was thinking," he answered slowly, "you know it is a temperance lecture, and it is by a wonderful man. The fellows in the shop have been talking about him all day, and they say you just can't help thinking when he gets a-going, and I was just thinking, what if we could get him to go, and he would listen, and get to thinking." There were no italics that will give you an idea of the peculiar emphasis which the boy put on the pronouns. Sally understood that he could mean but one person in the world. But her brother must have answered the look on her face, for she spoke no word. "Sometimes they do, Sally. There was old Pete, you know." Oh, yes, Sally knew old Pete. Everybody in that alley knew him. A notorious drunkard once, of the sort which people, even good Christian people, are apt to pronounce hopeless. Yet now he wore a neat suit of clothes every day, and brought home 20 pounds of flour at one time in a sack, and bought his coal by the barrel. Wonderful things occasionally happened in that alley. "Yes," said Sally, "that is true, and old Pete wasn't much like him." The tone spoke volumes. It would have almost angered her, even now, to have it hinted at that old Pete was superior to her father, though hardly a person acquainted with the two but would have said that there was more hope for old Pete, even in his miserable past, than for this one. How they managed it, those two. The difficult task of getting him persuaded to go, find then the more difficult task of keeping him sufficiently sober to get there, would make a story in itself. I fancy there are many such stories in real life which will never get told. The probabilities are, if they were, some wise critic would pronounce them unnatural and sensational. Suffice it to say that the task was accomplished, and among the most attentive listeners to the great speaker that evening was Sally's father, while she sat at home and mended a badly torn jacket, and cried now and then, and was glad and sorry and proud and frightened and hopeful by turns all that long evening. I am not sure but it was better for her that she sat at home. I don't know just what she might have done had she been in the hall to see her father, at the close of the meeting, shamble forward with the crowd, and sign his name to the total abstinence pledge. She might have screamed out in her excitement, or she might have fainted; for although there were those who said, some with a sneer and some with a sigh, that "signing the pledge would not amount to anything, the miserable fellow could not keep a pledge to save his life," Sallie would have thought nothing of the kind. She had faith in her father's word. It is a wonderful stimulus to have someone who believes in us. Chapter 25 of Ester Ried Yet Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ester Ried Yet Speaking by Pansy. Chapter 25. What do you hope to accomplish? "Do you know," said Mrs. Roberts, addressing Gracie Dennis, who, with young Ried, had waited in the hall for her to join them, they were ready for the lecture, and were to take up Mr. Roberts on the way, "do you know that I have a desire which I see no way of realizing? If Mr. Colson should bring his sister with him tonight, I should like so much to get possession of her, and bring her home with me. But I have been planning all day, and see no possible excuse for such an apparently wild proceeding." I want you to notice how naturally Mrs. Roberts said Mr. Colson. She never talked about Dirk under any other name. She even taught herself to think of him as Mr. Colson. Consequently, when she spoke the name in his presence, there was not a trace of unnaturalness in tone or manner. The others tried in vain to follow her example. Dr. Everett could not speak of him in this way without slight hesitation and a touch of embarrassment. "The truth is," said he, "I think Dirk all the week, and on the Sabbath I find it impossible to reach up to Mr. Colson without an effort." There was no touch of reaching up or reaching down about Mrs. Roberts' talk with her pupils. It is possible that this is one link in the chain of influence which she was weaving around them. Gracie Dennis's face expressed curiosity, and when they were seated in the carriage, she referred to the cause. "But, Flossy, I cannot imagine why you should want to do such a thing. It will certainly be too late tonight to try to get acquainted with her. I should think some time when you could have an unbroken evening would be the better for experimenting." "For some sorts of experimenting it would," Mrs. Roberts answered, smiling quietly. "My experiment, in part at least, was to see how the pink room might impress her." "Flossy Shipley!" When Gracie took refuge in that name her hostess knew she was not only much excited, but a trifle disapproving. At such times she made haste to change the subject. It happened that the thing for which she had been planning shaped itself so naturally as to give not the slightest color or premeditation to the act. When Dirk and his sister worked their way through the dense crowds to the open air, they discovered that it was raining heavily. For almost the first time in her life the fact struck terror to Mart Colson's soul. Ordinarily no duck could have been more indifferent to a rainstorm than herself. On this evening she gave vent to her dismay in short, expressive words. "Sallie's bonnet! And cape!" This last after a moment's thought. "And shoes!" she added, as the magnitude of her troubles grew upon her. Drawn up close to the sidewalk stood a carriage and a pair of horses that Dirk could not help giving admiring attention to, despite the rain. A fine horse always held his attention. No thought of the occupants of the carriage came to him, not even after a head leaned forward and a hand beckoned. Of course it was beckoning to somebody else. Then a clear voice spoke. "Mr. Colson!" He started quickly forward. There was but one person who ever said "Mr. Colson," and besides that voice belonged only to one. "I want your sister to go home with me. It is raining so hard that she ought not to walk, and I should like very much to have her stay with me tonight. Won't you ask her to, please?" If Mrs. Roberts had been asking a favor instead of conferring one, her voice could not have been sweeter and more winning. Dirk went back to his sister, too much bewildered by the state of affairs even to express surprise. "Mart," he said, "she wants you." A quick spring to the sidewalk, and young Ried was standing beside Mart. "It is raining so hard," he explained. "Mrs. Roberts would be very glad if you would come." And Mart, thinking of nothing at all save Sallie's bonnet and cape and shoes, turned toward the waiting carriage. Mr. Ried had his umbrella raised and carefully shielded the bonnet, assisting its wearer to enter the carriage with as much courtesy as he had bestowed on Gracie Dennis but a few moments before. Not a movement was lost on the watching Dirk. When the door was closed and the good nights had been said, Mrs. Roberts leaning from the carriage again for that purpose, and when the horses had dashed around the corner, he still occupied the position on the curbstone, gazing down the street, gazing at nothing unless he saw a reflection of his own bewildered thoughts. "Come," said a policeman who knew him, and was therefore suspicious, "what are you hanging about here for? Move on." "Humph!" said Dirk, as he slowly took his hands out of his pockets, eyes still fixed on the corner where the carriage had turned. "What if I should?" Something in his eye would have told Mrs. Roberts, had she been there, that he meant more than moving down the street, though that he presently did, regardless of wind and rain. Meantime the bonnet and cape in the carriage stepped somewhat into the background, and the girl who wore them allowed herself once more to think of her individuality, and to wonder at her position. She sat bolt upright on the edge of the soft gray seat, and gazed about her as well as she could by the glimmer of the street lamps. She in a carriage! Mart Colson sitting on a back seat, beside a grand lady, and rolling down the avenue! Who would have supposed that such a thing could have happened to Sallie Calkins's bonnet? Mrs. Roberts recognized the bonnet and cape with a smile of satisfaction. She had studied much over the possibilities of this girl's costume. Was it probable that she had anything suitable to wear to a lecture? She had passed the cellar where the girl lived but once, and had had but one glimpse of her. Yet these glimpses had been enough to render it highly improbable that she had any street costume. Then, had Mrs. Roberts canvassed the possibilities of getting a street suit for her, there were apparently insurmountable difficulties in the way. She was too utterly unacquainted with the ground to venture. Besides, there were reasons for believing that anything of value would find its way from that cellar to a pawnbroker's in a very short space of time. Having spent hours over many different schemes, and rejected each one as liable to bring disaster, Mrs. Roberts was obliged to betake herself to prayer. If the watching Saviour wanted her to work through the medium of this lecture on this particular child of his, he could certainly see that she was present, could furnish her with clothes to wear, either through herself or some other of his servants. She would wait and watch. Not once had she thought of Sallie Calkins and the new bonnet that her own fingers had helped to fashion. Yet here it was beside her on the head of this girl, toward whom she was drawn. The fact made Mrs. Roberts radiant. She said almost nothing to the startled prisoner at her side, beyond a murmured, "So glad you could let me carry you home with me." Then she drew a bright-colored wrap about her, and left her to her amazement, while the eager tongues of the rest of the party talked continuously. "By the way, you are not acquainted with the pink room, I think. You should see it before it is invaded for the night. Large it is. I think little people sometimes have a peculiar fondness for large rooms. Mrs. Roberts had. The walls were tinted with what might be called a suggestion of pink, with just a touch of sunset gold about the moldings. The carpet was soft and rich. It gave back no sound of footfall. It was strewn with pink buds, some just opening into beauty, some half blown. Accustomed to the sight of elegant carpets as you are, you would almost have stooped to pick one of these buds, they looked so real. The curtains to the windows were white, but lined with rose pink. They were looped back with knots of pink ribbons. The bed was a marvel of pink and white drapery, so was the dressing bureau. The easy chairs were upholstered in soft grays with a pinkish tinge, and the tidies, lavishly displayed, were all of pink and white. There was nothing conventional about the room. A professional would have been shocked by some of its appointments. Many a lady of wealth, accustomed to having things as they decree, would have been more than doubtful over the pink ribbons and the profusion of white drapery. Aside from the carpet and a choice picture or two, there was nothing especially expensive about the furnishings. It was simply a room in which Mrs. Roberts had allowed her own sweet little fancies to take her captive. The gas was lighted, the door was ajar into a toilet room, a lavish display of great, beautiful towels could be seen as you peeped in, and various touches told of an expected guest. Flowers were blossoming on the mantel, and a tiny vase which stood on a bracket near the toilet stand held a single rose of a peculiar hue and perfume, which had blossomed for this hour. At least Mrs. Roberts thought so. Into this room, with all its purity and beauty, went Sallie Calkin's bonnet and cape and her strong, new, thick shoes, and the wearer thereof pushed the bonnet away from her flushed face, and stood and looked about her. Downstairs they discussed in curious tones, not her, but the mistress of the mansion. "Flossy, I do think you are too queer for anything. Why don't you have her go to Katie's room? Katie is away for the night, you know, and I'm sure her room is as neat and pretty as can be. Imagine what a contrast it would be to anything that she has ever seen. Mr. Ried, you ought to see the room into which she has been put. There isn't a more elegant one in the house. Some of its furnishings are so delicate that I hardly like to touch them. What sort of a disease is it that has taken Mrs. Roberts, do you suppose, to send her there? Flossy, she will get no rest to-night. She will be afraid of that immaculate bed." This, of course, was Gracie Dennis. Mr. Roberts looked from her to his wife, his face smiling, curious, yet with a sort of at-rest expression. "What do you hope to accomplish, Flossy?" He asked the question as one who was pleased to watch a new experiment, yet felt sure that the experimenter had an end to attain which would justify any measures that she might take. Mr. Roberts had believed in his wife when he chose her from all others, but he was learning to believe in her in a peculiar sense, as one led by a hand that made no mistakes. She turned to answer his question, her face bright yet half puzzled. "I am not sure that I can explain to you what I hoped for," she said. "I caught the idea from Mr. Ried." "From me?" and the young man thus mentioned looked so astonished and incredulous that Gracie laughed. "He is sure he never thought of anything so wild," she said gayly. "Flossy, you must find a better excuse than that." "Yet it was something that he said. Do you remember telling me, not long ago, about your sister's idea that all the world had lost its place because of sin, that God intended everything here to be beautiful, and all life to be bright with joy, and that Satan had gotten hold of men's lives, and was trying to ruin them, and that every beautiful creation was God's picture to the world of what his intention had been? I'm telling it poorly, but it made a very deep impression. This girl's face, you know, is beautiful. It is what God meant some faces to be. At least, I mean he has given her the frame for a face of beauty. I have a vague, half-understood sort of wish to give her a glimpse of harmony, something that will fit her golden hair and lovely complexion, and see what she will think of God's idea, and whether she will understand that it is sin which has spoiled it, and whether she is willing to serve the author of her ruin. I don't believe I am making myself plain, but I know what I mean at least. If we do not, I think it must be because you have caught a thought from God that we are unable to reach up to." It was Mr. Roberts who made this reply. Something in his wife's experiment had deeply moved him. As for Mr. Ried, his face lighted, as it always did, at the mention of his sister's name. "Sometimes I almost think that it is Ester still at work, and that he lets her work through this woman." It was what he said to Gracie Dennis in an aside. Mrs. Roberts had already gone to see in person to the comfort of her guest. Chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Ester Ried Yet Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ester Ried Yet Speaking by Pansy. Chapter 26. Oh Lord, take Dirk too. She found her standing before the mirror. By reason of the fact she understood no pretty trick of braid or curl, her long yellow hair hung just as nature had made it, with no waves or ripples save those which had grown with its growth. It fell about her now like a sunset cloud. She had taken from the vase near at hand a rose, which she had pushed in among the masses of hair, with no knowledge as to how it should be arranged, or, indeed, thought. Yet the effect was something which made Mrs. Roberts give an involuntary start of admiration. Still it was evident that, though apparently gazing at herself, she was thinking away beyond herself. It is doubtful if at that moment she saw the flower, or her own reflection, or knew that she was looking. Her eyes had the faraway expression which one sometimes sees in great power on faces like hers. She turned as Mrs. Roberts, having softly knocked and received no answer, softly entered, and her first words indicated the intensity of her thought, whatever it was. "Dirk has got to go there." "Go where?" asked Mrs. Roberts, startled out of the words she meant to speak, startled by the hint of power in the voice and manner. "Of whom are you thinking, my dear girl? And where do you want him to go?" "I'm thinking about Dirk, ma'am. I thought about him all the evening. The man made me. And I've made up my mind. He's got to go to heaven." I suppose I cannot give you an idea of the force in her voice. It was as though a resolution, from which there could be no appeal, had been taken, and the person resolving felt her own power to accomplish. It was altogether an unexpected answer to Mrs. Roberts. She did not know whether to be half frightened or to laugh. She sat down in one of the easy chairs to study the girl, and consider what answer to make. Mart, meantime, turned back to the survey of herself in the mirror, or to the survey of whatever she saw there, and continued talking. "I never knew much about heaven. You may guess that if you have ever been in our alley. Only lately Sallie Calkins she's been telling me what you told her, and I had a kind of notion that you must know what you was talking about, and that it was for rich folks and grand folks like you. But the man told about that Madge, you know, to-night, an awful drunkard and swearer and all that, how she reformed and went to heaven. Dirk ain't no drunkard, but he will be. Everybody says he will, because father is such an awful one. Mother, she's never had no hope of him. She says father didn't drink till he was most 20, and then he begun. And she's looking for Dirk to begin, and I haven't thought he could help it either. What if he doesn't care for it much yet? He will, it's likely. I've never told nobody that, not even Sallie, and I've been mad at mother every time she said any such thing. But all the time I've been expecting him to begin, and I know well enough, when once they begin, how it goes on. But that man to-night told things that made a difference. He said that God can keep them from wanting to drink, and help them right straight along, and that they can go to heaven as well as the next one. I've wanted nice things for Dirk all my life, but I never saw no way to get them, and it made me mad. To-night I saw a way, but I never had no kind of a notion how heaven looked till I came into this room, and see the light and the flowers and the shine, and another room spread out there in the glass. And now I know, and Dirk shall go." Mrs. Roberts was in no mood for laughing, the tears were dropping slowly on the flower she held in her hand. Mart saw in the glass just then a sight which seemed to add to her surprise. She turned wondering eyes on her hostess. "What are you crying for?" she asked. "Don't spoil the flower. It is like the one Dirk brought me once. He said you sent it to me. I kept it most a week. I took it over to Sallie's, and she got fresh water for it every day, somehow, and it was then she begun to tell me what you said about heaven, and I thought if God had made such flowers as that for you, it was likely he had made a heaven for you, but I didn't believe it was for Dirk till to-night, and I didn't have no kind of a notion how it looked till just now. Do you believe what that man said, that folks like Dirk can go? Of course, if Madge went, why Dirk would have a right. He is bad just because he has to be. He never had no chance to be anything else, and he ain't very bad anyhow, nothing to compare with some." Her voice was almost fierce in its earnestness. She was beginning to resent the creeping doubt that Mrs. Roberts' silence suggested. Careful words must be spoken now. What if this awakening soul should be turned aside? No wonder that the unspoken words were prayers. "Dirk has a right to go to heaven," she said, steadily, sweetly. "There is not the shadow of a doubt as to his right. No one in the world, not Satan himself, can deprive him of it, and it is not only his right, but his duty to go." "Then he shall." I wish I could give you an idea of the strength in the girl's voice. It almost carried conviction with it to Mrs. Roberts' heart. "Come and sit down," she said, and she drew her towards one of the low cushions. If Mart sat on that, her head would be just where a gentle hand could stroke the masses of hair. "Let me talk with you about this. You are mistaken in one thing. Dirk is very bad. He is bad enough to shut him out of heaven forever." The girl started, and tried to fling off the caressing hand. "So are you," said the gentle voice. "Oh, me! Don't talk about me! Whoever said I wasn't bad? Let me go. I want to go home. I don't care how hard it rains." "And so am I," continued the gentle voice. The girl on the cushion ceased struggling to free herself from the caressing touch, and remained motionless. "Let me tell you of something that we have each done a great many times. We have been asked and urged and coaxed day after day, and year after year, to accept an invitation to go to this very heaven, and we have paid no attention at all. And this, after Jesus Christ had given his life to make a way for us to go. Is not that being bad?" "Dirk, he never had no invitation, never heard anything about it." "Yes, he has," speaking with quiet firmness. "The Lord Jesus Christ told me to invite him, and I have done so a great many times, and he has made no answer. And Sallie Calkins has invited you, and you have treated it in just the same way." "I didn't believe it." "Isn't that being bad? What has he ever done that you should refuse to believe his word, when he died an awful death to prove to you that he was in earnest?" "You said Dirk had a right to go." "So he has. Jesus Christ has given him a right, if he will. I have invited you to my house, and asked you to spend the night in this room, and sleep in this bed. Has any person a right to keep you from doing so?" "No," an emphatic nod of the head, and a lingering, almost loving look at the white bed behind her. "Then cannot you truthfully say that you have a right to be here? My dear girl, it is so faint an illustration of what Jesus Christ has done to give you a right to heaven, that I almost wonder at your understanding it. But can you imagine something of how I should have felt had I urged you to come to me night after night, for weeks and years, and you turned from me with no answer, or else with scorn?" "You wouldn't have kept on asking me." Mart spoke with the assurance of one who had firm faith in her statement. "No, I presume I should not. I would have said after the third or fourth invitation, 'If she really will not have anything to do with me, I cannot help it,' and I should have tried to forget you. This is one of the many differences between Christ and me. He waits and asks, and asks. How long will you keep him waiting?" "I have given you only the beginning of the conversation. It was long ere it was concluded." Downstairs Mr. Ried waited as long as he could, curious to know the result of Mart's first impressions. Then he went away, and Gracie went to her room, and the house settled into quiet, and Mr. Roberts, in the library, waited for his wife, while she told over again, with tender words and simple illustrations, the old, old story, so fitted to the wants of the world. How many times has there been a like result? It was midnight when they knelt together, the fair child of luxury and the child of poverty; but the Saviour, who intercedes for both, bent his ear, and heard again the cry of a groping soul, seeking him out of darkness, and held out his loving, never failing arms, able to reach down to her depth, and received her to himself. Who can tell that story? Who can describe how heaven seemed to the girl just then? It was not what Mrs. Roberts had expected. I cannot even say that it was what she had hoped for. Her faith had not reached to such a height at all. She could hardly have put into words what she hoped. When she ventured to try to tell it to the friends in the parlor, and to you, I doubt whether you understood. She thought to get a hold on the girl, to show her something of God's beauty and love, as it shone through herself, to make her long after something her life did not give, and to gradually lead her to seek after satisfaction in Christ. A long process, something that should unfold gradually, with many discouraging drawbacks, and some days that would look like utter failures. She had schooled herself to be prepared for this, but she had not looked for Him to exert His mighty power to save in a moment. How it had touched her to find a soul, hungry, not for itself, but for a brother, I shall not attempt to tell. The first words she said, after she went back to her waiting husband, a little after midnight, were these: "He could not do many mighty works there because of their unbelief. I think that is what is the matter with the world today. I wonder if He would not be pleased with one who could throw herself at His feet with a childlike abandon of faith, and expect wonders, yes, and impossibilities, just as a child feels that anything can be done by Father. God has shamed my faith tonight. It is as though I had asked for a crumb of bread, and he gave me the entire loaf. That girl upstairs has not heard of him before as a Savior for her, has never thought of such a thing, or at least dreamed of its possibility, and yet she has given herself to him. And, Evan, what do you think were the first words she said? 'O Lord, take Dirk too.' She is on her knees at this moment praying for him. If you could have seen her face when it first dawned upon her that she could tell God about him and ask for his mighty power to be exerted on his behalf, it would have been a picture for your lifetime. Oh, Evan, Evan, why can we not expect great things of God?" End of chapter 26. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 27 of Ester Ried Yet Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ester Ried Yet Speaking by Pansy. Chapter 27. An Awful Problem. Isn't it strange, the ways the Lord takes to answer prayers? Much prayer had been made for Dirk Colson, but few had thought of his sister. Sallie Calkins, it is true, had come with trembling steps into the light of Christ's love, and had immediately desired to have Mart enjoy it with her, but was very trembling and doubting as to her ability to reach Mart, or to influence her in the right direction. She sent the bonnet and cape to the lecture with a prayer, but she did not look for the prayer to be answered. Verily, he has to be content with faith less than a grain of a mustard seed. Was the rest of the story an answer to prayer? We are to remember that he has strange ways. Events startling enough in their import followed each other in rapid succession. In the first place, Dirk's father, poor, wrecked man, returned no more. Whether he had wandered among the network of railroads which lined the southern portion of the city, and lost his life there, or whether he had fallen into the river, or just how he had disappeared, could not be discovered. There were 3 men killed by an accident on the road one night, but their disfigured bodies were buried before Dirk heard of it. There was a man seen struggling in the water off the lower wharf one evening, but he sank before help could reach him, and his body was not recovered. There were half a dozen men killed by a boiler explosion, but that was not heard of in time to look into it. There were so many ways in which the wreck might have gone out of life and left no sign. They were safe in supposing that he was intoxicated, and that was about all they could be perfectly sure of concerning him, that and the fact that he came no more. Of course, there was no such search for him as is made for the man of respectability and position. To one who had some idea of the worth of a soul, it is pitiful to see what a tiny ripple this disappearance made on the surface of life. A moment of startled questioning by those who lived in the immediate neighborhood, a few women with aprons thrown over their heads congregating in groups around the pump, or before the door of the bakery, a crowd of dirty children, stopping their play for a moment and speaking lower, then the tide of noisy, fighting, swearing life went on. One was gone out from it. Whither? None knew, few cared, and there were such crowds and crowds left, how could he be missed? One missed him, an abused, insulted, downtrodden woman, one whom, years before, he had promised to love and cherish until death parted them, and had broken the vows almost as soon as taken, and never renewed them again. Yet that woman wept bitter tears over his absence, watched for him, listened nightly for his staggering steps, rose up from her heap of straw in the corner in the middle of the night, and set wide open the cellar door, and listened to the angry voices floating down to her from some drunken brawl further up the street, if, perchance, she might hear his; listened, and held her breath, and quavered all over with hope and fear; then crept back to her miserable bed, covered her head with the ragged quilt, and cried herself into a few hours of forgetfulness. "She is crying herself to death about him," Mart said. There was surprise mingled with awe in her voice. She told it to Dirk, and the two stood thoughtfully for a moment looking out at the one window. They carefully avoided looking at each other. They did not understand. To them there was simply relief in the father's absence. They had no trace of love for him in their hearts. The word father meant nothing to them but misery. Still there was that in them which respected the mother's grief. They tried to shield her. Dirk, of his own thoughtfulness, brought home a bit of tea in a paper, and bought half a pint of milk at the corner bakery, and Mart took lessons of Sallie, and made a delicate slice of toast, and borrowed Sallie's 1 cup and saucer to serve the tea in. She was disappointed that the mother cried and could hardly drink the tea. She was even almost vexed that the mother said with tears that "poor Jock always did like tea so much, and she had always thought that maybe if he could have had it hot and strong he would not have taken to the drink." Mart had no faith in this, no belief that anything in her father's past life could have kept him from the drink, but she held herself silent, and let the tears have their way. All the time she had in her heart one great solemn regret. There was one who would have helped her father, would and could have saved him, even from rum. What if she, his daughter, had known the Lord Jesus, and could have taken the miserable father to Him, and had him transformed? Mart had no doubt about His power to do it. An unanswerable argument had been given her. No infidel need try to assail her now. But the father! Why had everybody kept silence and let him sink away? Awful! Why had she not known Christ? Why had she not listened to Sallie but a week before? Why had not Dirk learned the way and saved his father? An awful problem. Mart's life must henceforth be shadowed by it. Meantime, what was Mrs. Roberts to do for this newborn soul? How was she to help her, and, through her, to help her brother? She, in her elegant home, sat down to study this problem. Life at East 55th Street was so far removed from life in the alley that she knew nothing about the missing father. Days passed, and, busy with many claims of society, she had made no movement toward helping the girl, and knew as yet no way to do it. Yet she carried her on her heart. Monday evening came and went, and still she had been detained from any effort. One afternoon her thoughts shaped themselves into action. She would go and see Mart. She would get Dirk to protect her in her journey down the alley, also, in accomplishing this, she would accomplish another thing. She would call on Dirk at his place of business. The chief of the office was a Christian man, yet she had reason to believe that he knew less about Dirk, and cared much less for him, than he did for his little dog, who sat in the window and barked at passers-by. She had no difficulty in securing attention. Ladies were not often admitted, but a card bearing the name Mrs. Evan Roberts was sufficient passport among any of the business men of the city. Mr. Stone was more than ready, he was eager to serve her. What could he do for the elegantly dressed lady whose carriage waited at the door, while she came in person among the bales and boxes? Her business must be urgent. It was. Could she speak with Mr. Colson just for a moment? She would not detain him long, but she wished to make an appointment with him for the next day. Mr. Colson! The chief and his perplexed assistant looked at each other thoughtfully, and shook their heads. There was no such person connected with their establishment. She must have the wrong number. No, she was positive. "He told me only 3 days ago that he was in your employ. He is on the 3rd floor, I believe." The gentlemen looked at each other again. "Colson," repeated Mr. Stone. "There is certainly a mistake. Briggs is in charge on the 3rd floor front, and Dixon has the back rooms. No, Mrs. Roberts, we have no such name among our men, I am positive." But Mrs. Roberts gently held her ground. She was sure she was not mistaken, for she had talked with him about his work and the different men. He was in Mr. Briggs' department, she felt quite sure. He was not a foreman, she explained, but quite a young man, had been there but a few weeks, and Dr. Everett was the one who had interested himself in securing the place. Light of some sort began to dawn on the perplexed faces of the gentlemen. "Can she mean Black Dirk, do you suppose?" questioned the elder, looking hard at his associate. Then came the sweet voice of the visitor. "Oh, no, he is not a colored gentleman. His name is Colson, Mr. Derrick Colson." "That is the one," said the gentleman quickly. Should he laugh or be annoyed? It took but a moment after that to summon Mr. Derrick Colson. Black he was, certainly, not only by reason of his naturally dark skin, but because of the grimy work, whatever it was, which fell to his lot. His big apron was soiled with ink and oil, and daubed with bits of dark color which seemed not to be either. He came forward with his usual shambling gait, and an additional shade of sullenness apparent on his face, but it glowed a swarthy red when he recognized the lady. "Good afternoon, Mr. Colson," she said, and she held forth her delicately gloved hand. His own went forward to meet it, then drew suddenly back. "It is not clean enough," he said. "There is ink or something on it." But the lavender kids were not withdrawn. "Never mind the ink. A little honest soil never hurt anybody," and the rough, dark hand was taken in her own. Then occurred a few moments' chat; at least the lady chatted with easy familiarity. She referred to the social parlors, to the Monday evenings, to Miss Dennis's musicale, to half a dozen themes about which the bewildered gentleman within hearing knew nothing. Could it be that the low-voiced, gentle lady was trying to give them a lesson as well as to talk with Dirk? Finally she made an appointment for the next afternoon. Would his employer be so kind as to excuse him for an hour if convenient? Certainly it would be convenient to please Mrs. Evan Roberts. Dirk was very much embarrassed. He blushed and stammered, and did not know how to answer any of the kindnesses. But there were two things during the interview which gave Mrs. Roberts more pleasure than you, perhaps, are able to understand. One was that at sight of her he had suddenly snatched off the paper cap which he wore, and the other, that having set it again on his head as he turned from her, he glanced back from the door, and, in answer to her bow and smile, lifted the ugly little cap with an air that was an exact imitation of young Ried, and yet so well done that you would not have thought of it as an imitation. Mrs. Roberts could have clapped her hands, but she did not. Instead, she said sweetly: "I am very glad that Mr. Colson is in the employ of a Christian gentleman. He is greatly in need of help from all Christian sources, and I am sure that there is that in him which will respond to judicious effort." Then she let the bewildered man attend her to her carriage, and went her way rejoicing. But there were plans being laid for her at that moment of which she knew nothing. Tomorrow she would go and see the golden-haired girl. In a neatly packed basket she had certain things, among them a bonnet and a sack that she knew would fit the hair and face, and she believed would give Mart pleasure. If only she could contrive a natural way to give them to her, and there could be planned ways of keeping them safe from the pawnbroker's grasp. All this time she knew nothing of the fact that the hand which had grasped for years to furnish the pawnbroker was stilled forever. It had not once occurred to Dirk to tell her. It is a solemn fact that in this greater excitement he had actually forgotten it. As for the "Christian employer," he did not know of it to tell. He had not so much as known whether Black Dirk had a father or not. He was simply a street rough, whom Dr. Everett was trying experiments with; and because there was an unusual pressure on the office, and poor help was better than none, he was helping the experiment. However, when Dirk went home from the office that night, he remembered that his father was gone. Mart met him at the door, a look of solemn determination on her face. "Dirk," she said, "she's going. As sure as you live, she's going. She's been bad all the afternoon. Sallie says that Mark's doctor will come to see her. She knows he will, and Mark shall go for him as soon as he comes home, but I don't mean to wait for no doctor. I want her to come. She knows the way, and I want mother to be told it right, so there won't be no mistake. You go for her, Dirk, right off straight. There ain't any time to lose, for I tell you now she's going. She's been failing all along, you know, and she has just cried herself down. Dirk, will you go for her as fast as you can?" The confusion of pronouns might have bewildered you. They did not Dirk. "Her" meant to him exactly what it did to Mart. He could not think how it could possibly mean any other person. But this was astounding news about his mother. It was one thing to have a father disappear, whom he had simply feared, until he had learned to hate. It was quite another thing to talk about the going away of the only one who had ever tried to mend his clothes, and who had sat up nights to wash them when she could. He strode past Mart into the wretched room, and looked at the bed in the corner. The mother was asleep, but on her face was a strange change. A something that he had never seen there before, worn and sunken as it always was. It made him understand Mart's fears. "I'll go," he said huskily, and rushed from the house. Her carriage was just rolling down the avenue as his swift feet cleared the alley. He knew the horses. He was a little ahead of them, but it was not probable that the driver would stop for him. "Won't you stop that carriage?" he said in a breathless haste to a policeman at the corner. "I've got to speak to the lady that's in it." "I'll be quite likely to, no doubt," said the policeman in quiet irony. "What rascality are you up to now, Dirk? Can't you be decent for a few days?" But Dirk was trying to free himself from the detaining hand, and threw up one arm in a sort of despairing gesture to the coachman. Mr. Roberts caught the signal, recognized the face, and in another moment the horses stood restlessly by the curbstone, and Dirk, his embarrassment gone, told his brief story rapidly. "Father went off a spell ago and never came back, and mother, she is sickly, and it set her crying, and she's going, Mart thinks, and I guess it's so, and Mart wants you to come and show her the way. She said you knew how, and you would come." End of chapter 27. Recording by Tricia G. Chapter 28 of Ester Ried Yet Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ester Ried Yet Speaking by Pansy. Chapter 28. May She Go With Me? Of course she went. And of course, now that the truth was known, much was done. Dr. Everett was summoned. The wretched bed, with its distressing rags, were turned out together, and a comfortable one took its place. Broths and teas and jellies and physical comfort of every kind were furnished, and the doctor did his best to battle with the disease that long years of wanton misery had fastened upon their victim. It was all too late, of course. It was true, what Mr. Roberts sadly said, that half of the effort, expended years or even months before, might have saved the poor tortured life. But now— How awful those "too lates" are! Isn't it a wonder that we ever take the risk of having one ring in our ears forever? There was one thing over which these Christian workers shed tears of joy. "I am too late," said Dr. Everett, "but my Master has as much power today as ever. He can save her." And he did. The poor, tired woman, who years before had remembered an old story well enough to name her one daughter Martha, in memory of the one who "loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus," roused her dull heart at the mention of his name, and listened while the wonderful story was told her that he loved not only Martha and her sister, but her own poor, sinful, wrecked self, loved her enough to reach after her, and call and wait, and prepare for her a home in his glory. Dear! Why has not someone come with the news before? Surely she would have listened during these long sad years. Well, they made the way plain. Neither was it a difficult thing to do. The woman was weary and travel-stained and afraid, and longed for nothing so much as a place of refuge. She knew that she was a sinner, she knew that she was, and had been for many a year, powerless to help herself. Why should she not hail with joy the story of a great and willing helper? "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden." She opened her eyes with a gleam of eagerness to hear the words. Weary? Yes, indeed. Heavy laden? Who more so? If the call was not for her, whom could it mean? What else? Why, what, but the glorious old story, "I will give you rest." What wonder that she closed her eyes and smiled? What wonder that the first words after that were, "I'll come, show me how." And he showed her how. "Dirk," the sister said, when the mother had gone the last and only restful journey of her life, "Dirk, she went to heaven. And I'm going. I've been wanting to tell you for more than a week, but I didn't know how. He asked me to, and I'm going. Now you must. Because we never had a good time here, and she'll kind of expect it in heaven, and be looking out for you. She always looked out for you, Dirk." Then did Dirk lose his half-sullen self-control, and great tears rolled down his dark cheeks. But the sister shed no tears. She had serious business to attend to. Dirk must go to heaven now, without fail. One day there was an unusual scene in the alley. It was no uncommon thing to see a coffin carried out from there, but on this day there was a hearse, and a minister in Dr. Everett's carriage, and Dirk and his sister in neat apparel came out together and were seated in Mr. Roberts' carriage, and all the boys of the Monday evening class walked arm in arm after the slow-moving carriages. and the children of the alley stopped their placing and their fighting, and the women stood silent in doorways, and took, most of them, their very first lesson in the proprieties of life. "She's got a ride in a carriage at last, poor soul," said one, thinking of the worn-out body in the coffin; and another said, "I wonder what poor old Jock would think of all this." But the scene made its impression and left its lesson. I think the voices of some of them were lowered during the rest of the day because of it. What next? It was the question that filled Mrs. Roberts' thoughts. Something must be done for Dirk and Mart. That fearful alley was no place for human beings, certainly not for these two. But what to do with them was a question not easily answered. Various plans were proposed. Sallie Calkin's 2 rooms were much better than the cellar in which the Colson family had lived, and there was a chance to rent a room next to Sallie's, with a closet opening from it for Dirk. How would it do to have them board with Sallie? The suggestion came first from Gracie Dennis, and sounded reasonable. Mrs. Roberts was almost ashamed to dislike it as much as she did. Sallie's neat rooms were home now. The father, for this length of time at least, held to his pledge; and son and daughter were radiant over him. He had gone to work, and already the 2 rooms were taking on an air of greater comfort because of the little things that he proudly brought home. Sallie was doing her part wisely. The table was regularly laid now, with a white cloth and knives and forks, and 2 cups and plates had been added to the dishes. Would it be wise to invade this home just at this juncture and introduce boarders? Mrs. Roberts did not believe it would. It was not as though the father had an established character, and stood ready to shield his children. They were still acting the protective, and he had but too recently risen from the depths where Dirk and Mart had laughed and jeered at him. Besides, the rooms were located in that dreadful alley, and, do what she would, Mrs. Roberts could not feel that that dangerously beautiful face could find a safe abiding place in that alley. Some other way must be thought of. Their immediate future was arranged through the intervention of a house agent, for even that dreary and desolate cellar had its agent, who was eager to secure his rent. He was unwise enough to undertake to interview Mrs. Roberts as she descended from her carriage, not long after it had followed Mart's mother to the grave. He considered this effort of his a special stroke of business energy. He wanted to be patient with the poor, he said. There wasn't an agent in the city who waited for them oftener than he did. But business was business, and it stood to reason that he could not depend on a fellow like Dirk. It had been bad enough when the mother was there, but he couldn't think of such a thing as risking it now. What was he to understand? Did she mean to rent the room for them, and for how long? Because it was his duty to look out for the future. What would be more natural than for Mrs. Roberts, with those 2 young things looking on, to say that of course she would be responsible for the rent as long as they lived in the room? Thus reasoned the house agent. Instead of which, Mrs. Roberts turned toward Dirk, her face flushed over the hardness of the man who could stop a boy and girl on such business on their way from their mother's grave, and said, "If I were in your place, Mr. Colson, I should not rent these rooms at all. They are not suited to your sister's needs. I am sure you can do better." The agent was disgusted. Mr. Colson, indeed! The disreputable young scamp whom nobody trusted. He would show this silly woman a fact or 2. "Business is business," he repeated doggedly. "Either they must take the room, and pay the rent in advance, or else they must hustle out this very night." He had waited now 3 days after time for decency's sake, and more than that he couldn't and wouldn't do. Dirk stood looking from one to the other, the red coming and going on his swarthy face. Here was responsibility. He had not thought of it before. His mother was not there to count out the hoarded rent with trembling fingers, and save the wretched home to them for another month. She would never be there again. He had nothing with which to pay rent, he had nowhere to move. Yet she had called him Mr. Colson, and seemed to expect him to act for himself and Mart. It was she who answered the agent, but spoke to Dirk. "Very well, I suppose you are quite as willing to leave here tonight as at any time? If I were you I would leave immediately. Let your sister come home with me for the night, and until you have time to make other arrangements." Mr. Roberts had been summoned to a bank meeting, and had sent Ried to attend his wife. He came forward now, from the carriage where he had stood waiting, and laid a hand on Dirk's arm. "And you come home with me to night, Colson," he said in a cordial tone, such as he might have used with any young friend. "Then we will have a chance to talk things over and make plans." "That is nice," Mrs. Roberts said quickly, rejoicing in heart over Ried's promptness to act. "Then you can get away from this wretched place at once. Mr. Roberts will see to the removal of your goods, whatever you need, and the agent can call on him in the morning. That will be the simplest way to settle it all. May she go with me?" A slight, caressing movement of a gloved hand on the girl's arm accompanied this question. Mart was silent with bewilderment. When had Dirk ever before been asked what she might do, or might not do? At first she was half inclined to scorn the suggestion. Then suddenly it came to her with a sense of relief and protection. She was not alone. It was Dirk's business to think of and care for her. Would he do it? As for Dirk, no wonder that his face was deeply flushed. New thoughts were struggling in his heart. He was to decide for Mart. He was head of the home now. Mrs. Roberts waited anxiously. She longed exceedingly to rouse in the boy, who was already grown to the stature of a man, a sense of responsibility. A moment more and he had shaken himself free from the spell which seemed to bind him. "We'll do as you say." He spoke with the air of a man who had assumed his proper place and taken up his duties. "Mart, you go along with her, and I'll see about things tomorrow." And Mart, for the first time in her life, received and obeyed in silence a direction from her brother. Possibly Mrs. Roberts may have been mistaken, but she thought that much had been accomplished that day. Yet none of them realized whereunto this thing would grow. Mrs. Roberts, when she ushered Mart that evening into the pink room again, and showed her how to manage the hot and cold water, and which bell to ring if she needed anything, and in every imaginable way treated her as a guest, whom it was pleasant to serve, had really no plans just then, no hobby to ride, but simply acted out the dictates of her heart. You will remember that her Christian life had always been unconventional. The very fact that during her early childhood she had been painfully trammelled by what "they" would say or think, seemed to have had its influence over her later experiences. Since she had been made free, she would be free indeed; that is, with the liberty which Christ makes us free. What would please Him she resolved would be the one thought to which she would give careful attention. Now, it is perhaps worthy of mention, that this closely following disciple did not once stop to determine whether it would please Him to give such tender care to this stray child of His, nor whether she would be considered doing not just the thing, in His eyes, if she entertained her in the pink room. About what He could have her do next she gave much thought; and it was not for days, or rather weeks, that she caught the possibility of His meaning that the pink room should really be the girl's own. It was just this way. The weeks went by, and no plan for settling Mart comfortably elsewhere met Mrs. Roberts' approval. There was constantly some excellent reason why the one mentioned would not do. Meantime they became, she and Gracie Dennis, more and more deeply interested in Mart. In her wardrobe first. Wherever she lives she should have respectable clothing, this much is easily settled. So the matron decreed, and Gracie did not gainsay it. She became absorbed in preparing it. Such fascinating work! So many things were needed, and her skin was so delicate, and her eyes so blue, and Gracie's choice of shades and textures fitted her so precisely. Then, when dressed, simple though her toilet was, her remarkable beauty shone out so conspicuously as to alarm Mrs. Roberts whenever she thought of her in shop or store. Several times during the weeks she visited Sallie Calkins, and looked about her with a thoughtful air, and came away feeling that it would not do. There was Mark, growing into manhood, a good boy, hard-working, respectable, proud of his good homely sister, and of his reformed father. The 2 rooms were taking on every sort of homely comfort that Sallie's skill, helped by Mrs. Roberts' suggestions, could devise. It was growing into a model little home in its way, but there was not a corner in it where Mart would fit. Then, as the days passed, a subtle, fascinating change began to come over Mart. She slipped quietly into certain household duties. She showed marvelous skill with her needle, Such skill, indeed, that Gracie Dennis said more than once, "I'll tell you, Flossy, what to do with her. Put her in a good establishment, and let her learn the dressmaking trade. She would make her fortune in time." And Mrs. Roberts smiled, and assented to the statement, but not to the proposition. There was no dressmaking establishment known to her, where she was willing to place so young and pretty and ignorant a girl. But she was quite willing that Mart should learn the looping of dresses, and the fitting of sacques and collars and ruffles, and take many a stitch for her, as well as for Gracie. She was willing to have her do a dozen little nameless things, the ways of doing which she had caught up, until at last the touch of her fingers began to be felt about the rooms, and Mrs. Roberts began to notice that she should miss Mart when she went away. Still, from the first time she said this, the thought came afterward with a smile of satisfaction, and it was but a week afterward that she caught herself phrasing it, that she should miss her if she went away. What about Dirk? Young Ried could have told you more of him during these days than anybody else. He still stayed at the boarding house. Mrs. Saunders, the mistress of it, was one whom, if you had known her, you would feel sure could interest herself heartily in such as he. There was a bit of a room next to Ried's. To be sure, it had been used for a clothes press, and it took the busy housekeeper half the day to plan how she could get along without it, but she planned, and offered it to Ried for his protégé. "Just for the present, you know, until he sees what he can do, poor fellow," she said, and Ried accepted the little room joyfully, and helped fit it up. Chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Ester Ried Yet Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ester Ried Yet Speaking by Pansy. Chapter 29. What if I belonged? You think things are taking very rapid strides? Well, don't you know that there come periods when they do just that thing, or appear to? Why, even the buds on the trees teach us the lesson. How many springtimes have you gone to your bed feeling that the season was late, and the trees were bare, and the fruits would all be backward, and nature was dawdling along in a very wearisome fashion, and awakened in the morning to find that there had in the night been a gentle rain, and a movement of mysterious power among the buds and the grasses, and that now, in the morning sunshine, the world had burst into bloom? Yet, did you really suppose, after all, that the work was done in one night? There was progress of several sorts in the class at the South End. Even a casual observer could have seen a change in the boys that first Sunday after they had attended Dirk's mother to the grave. The dignity of that hour of sorrow was still upon them. Even the very reckless and world-hardened will offer a certain degree of respect to death. On ordinary occasions, the boys might have been merry at Dirk's expense, for they saw changes in him; but the memory of his mother's coffin kept them silent, and let his changed manner have its effect. That Sunday was full of small events to Dirk. At least, they are small enough when one puts them on paper, though I admit that they looked large to him. Several people interested themselves in his welfare. "Poor fellow," said Mrs. Saunders, "I suppose his mother tried to do for him. Just as likely as not she had a clean shirt for him of a Sunday morning." You will perceive that Mrs. Saunders, though all her life a resident of a large city, was not very well acquainted with the abject poor. In point of fact, Dirk Colson had had no extra clothing for his mother to make clean. But Mrs. Saunders, full of the motherly thought, yet finding no trace of a shirt in the bundle of rags that Dirk had brought with him, went down one day into the depths of an old trunk, and brought to light and mended, and washed and ironed, a shirt that had been long laid aside. It lay in its purity on a chair at the foot of Dirk's bed on Sabbath morning. He lay still and looked at it for a while, then arose and gave such careful attention to the soap and water as was new to him, and arrayed himself in the clean linen. His clothes were whole and clean. Mr. Roberts had seen to it that he went respectably dressed to his mother's funeral. A tap at his door a little later, and young Ried appeared, shoe brush and blacking box in hand. "Want to borrow?" he said, in the careless tone of one who might have supposed that the blacking of his boots was an everyday matter to this boy. "I always keep my own. It is cheaper than to depend on the street boys." Dirk said nothing at all, but reached forth his hand and took the offered tools, and the hint which came with them. When he went down to breakfast his boots shone, and his fresh paper collar was neatly arranged. Altogether he was not the boy to whom I first introduced you. I am not sure that Policeman Duffer would have recognized him. A collar and a necktie made a great difference in some people's personal appearance. Dirk wondered a little as to where the box of paper collars came from. The necktie he had just found lying in the bottom of the box. It was the mate of the one young Ried wore, but that told nothing, for both were simple and plain, and could be bought by the dozens in any furnishing store. It is small wonder that the boys in the class looked at him. Nimble Dick wore at first a roguish air, but a sudden memory of Dirk's face when he turned away from his mother's grave came in time. Open graves are not easy things to forget. Dirk went to church that day, went with young Ried by invitation, and sat in the pew behind Mr. Roberts. By the way, the seat which he occupied was another of Mr. Roberts' peculiarities. 3 seats were rented by him in the central part of the large church. One of these seats he and his wife regularly occupied. The others were almost as regularly occupied by the clerks from the store, who chose to make that their church home. 6 sittings to a pew. When a young man chose, Mr. Roberts was ready to enter into a business engagement with him, whereby the sitting should be considered his own. Mr. Roberts considering it to be no part of anyone's concern that the sum for which he thus sublet the sittings was not a tenth of what the first rental cost. It was in this way that Mr. Ried owned settings in the pew just back of that occupied by Mr. Roberts, and brought with him constantly one and another young man. Today the young man was Dirk Colson. It was all a strange world to him. He had wandered into the gallery of the mission chapel, and looked down from his perch on the crowd of worshippers, but this morning he was in the very center of things, as if he were one of them. Perhaps it is not strange that the startled inquiry came to his heart, "What if I belonged?" Where did he belong now? He had lost his place, he must make another. What if it should be in this neighborhood, among these surroundings? Such thoughts did not take actual shape to him, so that he could have put them into words. They merely hovered in his atmosphere. Mrs. Roberts sat so that he could look at her, which thing he liked to do. It had long since been settled in his mind that he had one friend, and that one was Mrs. Roberts. He admired Gracie Dennis, too, with a different sort of admiration from that which he gave to the matron. She might be all very well, and she was a splendid reader, and he knew that he could imitate her on certain sentences at least. And she had taught him to use the typewriter, an accomplishment which he meant to perfect himself in as soon as he had a chance. In fact, his ambition reached higher than that. One of these days he meant to make one of his own with certain improvements. Who shall say that Dirk was not growing? On this particular day there sat beside Mrs. Roberts a lady, a stranger. He could not see her face, but for some reason, which he did not understand, Dirk liked to look at her. She suggested something to him that seemed like a familiar dream. He thought much about her, and resolved to see if in her face she looked like any one he ever saw. As she turned at the close of the service, he was looking at her steadily. Lo, it was Mart! Now the possibility had not once suggested itself to his mind. If you think this doubtful, you merely show that you know nothing about the transforming effect of a becoming dress, no matter how simple it may be. Remember, Dirk had never but twice seen his sister in a bonnet. The first time it was Sallie's, and though the effect was sufficiently startling, yet Sallie's bonnet did not fit her face, as this creation of Gracie Dennis's fingers did. The second time the bonnet had been a hideous black one, proffered by an old woman who lived in the story above them, and whose thoughtfulness Mrs. Roberts would not mar by making any mention of the neat one which she had brought in a box that day. The black bonnet had been like a mask, hiding Mart's beauty. The bonnet that she wore now was not of that character. It told a wonderful story to Dirk's astonished gaze. Now, indeed, the likeness was plain. Without doubt, the girl whose face lighted with a curious smile at sight of him bore a striking likeness to the woman who had smiled at him whenever she met him. A curious effect this had on Dirk. There was that in his sister which made it possible for her to be something like the woman who had won his heart, and that sister was in his care. She had said so; he must work for her, and watch over her. I suppose that Sabbath was really the beginning of the surface changes in Mrs. Roberts' class. Not the beginning to the teacher, but to those people who only have eyes for strongly marked things. I know that it was but a few weeks afterward that Mrs. Roberts came home with such an unusual light in her eyes, and with her face so full of brightness, that her husband said, inquiringly, "What is it, Flossy?" She turned to him eagerly, ready to laugh. "It is what you will understand, but a great many people wouldn't. It is so nice that you understand things. I feel just like saying, 'Thank the Lord.'" "Do you mean to convey the idea that only a very few favored people feel like that? I don't know of a person who has not great occasion. What is your special one?" "Evan, the last boy had his boots blacked, and a fresh paper collar on." Mr. Roberts threw back his head and laughed, a genial, hearty laugh. His wife looked on, smiling. There is a great deal of character in a laugh, remember. You would have known that this was a sympathetic one. Mr. Roberts was entirely capable of realizing what this said to his wife about the future of her boys. It was becoming certain that their self-respect was awakened. A few days thereafter occurred another of those little things which mark some characters. Dirk, at Mrs. Saunders' breakfast table on Sabbath morning, heard talk that on Monday he recalled. By the way, I should have told you of one other way in which the Sabbath became a marked day to him. He slept in the little room which opened from Ried's, but his meals were picked up at a restaurant as occasion offered, a much nicer and surer method of living than he had ever known before. Even the commonest restaurant had great respectability to him. Yet you will remember that he had by this time taken several suppers in Mrs. Roberts' dining room. He knew that there was a difference in things. In fact, his experience now stretched over infinite differences. But the first time he sat down to Mrs. Saunders' breakfast table on a Sabbath morning he discovered another grade. This by no means belonged to the restaurant class. The Sunday breakfasts and dinners were some of Mrs. Saunders' quiet ways of helping along the work of the Christian world. Many a young man appeared at her table as the guest of Ried or of Dr. Everett, or of some other of the boarders, who was unaware that he owed the pleasant experience to the landlady. Well, Dirk at the Sabbath table heard talk of one General Burton, famous as a soldier, a scholar, and an orator. General Burton was in the city, the guest of a prominent man. He was to speak on the following evening in one of the great halls, and much eager talk was had concerning him. Great desire was expressed to hear him, to get a glimpse of him. Dirk listened in silence, but had his own thoughts about what it must be to have people talking about one, wanting to get a glimpse of one, and next, what it must be to intimate with such people. Did Mrs. Roberts know the great man? He wondered. And then Dirk smiled as he thought how queer it was that he should know Mrs. Roberts. That he might, in fact, be called intimately acquainted with her. Remembering this reverie of his, you will better understand how he felt on Monday morning, as he made his way in haste down a quiet part of one of the uptown streets, intent on an errand that required promptness, to hear his name called by Mrs. Roberts. "Good morning," she said. "Are you in too great haste to recognize your friends? I want to introduce you to a friend of mine. General Burton, Mr. Colson. General, this is one of my young men, of whom I told you." Whereupon the famous General, hero of many battles, held out his honored hand, and took Dirk's in a cordial grasp. I don't suppose I could explain to you what an effect this action had on a boy like Dirk. There is this comfort. You may be a student of human nature, and therefore may understand it all without explanation. This is only one of many so-called trifles which occurred during the weeks, to make their indelible impress on the characters of the boys. Of course, the Monday evenings prospered. Reading lessons and writing lessons, and, as time passed, lessons of all sorts, made good progress. Neatly blackened boots, carefully arranged hair, and fresh collars became the rule instead of the exception. Other avenues for improvement opened. It became noised abroad in Christian circles that great transformations were being worked among a certain set of hard young fellows who had hitherto been best known to the police. Mr. Roberts was interviewed by one and another, and one outgrowth of the talks was that tickets for a course of expensive and valuable and attractive lectures on popular subjects were placed in large numbers in Mr. Roberts' hands for him to use at discretion. Moreover, seats were rented in the church towards which most of the boys gravitated, the one connected with their mission; seats re-rented after Mr. Roberts' plan, so that as often as there appeared a young man who cared to have a spot in the church which belonged to him, it could be had for a very small sum; in fact, as pews rented in that church, a ridiculously small sum. These are only hints of the channels which time and patience and thought opened for these young men, on whom, but a short time before, Satan believed himself to have so firm a grip. One feature of the Monday evenings had, in the course of time, to be changed. The young teacher of elocution went home. "I want to go," she said at last, in answer to her hostess's pleading. "I think it quite likely that papa would let me stay and attend school here, but I am in haste to get home. You need not look sober, Flossy. I have had a happier time than I have ever had in my life before; and I have found here a sort of happiness that will last. It almost breaks my heart to think of leaving those boys, especially my dear Dick Bolton; but really I need to go home and undo certain things that I left badly done. You don't half know me, Flossy Shipley. When I came here I was a regular goose. If you had known what a simpleton I was, and how hateful I had been about some things at home, you would never have invited me. Among other things that were hateful about me, I was a real horror to my mother. I thought I had reason to distrust and dislike her, when the truth is that I have cause to go down on my knees and thank her for keeping me from some things. I'm in a real hurry to get home, and show that young mother of mine what a perfectly angelic daughter I can be." And Mrs. Roberts smiled and kept her own counsel, and this was all that she was supposed to know about her young guest. She never knew the whole story about Professor Ellis, though there was a girl, Hester Mason by name, in Dr. Everett's Sabbath school, who could have told her a good deal about him, and about Gracie Dennis's helping to break the net that Satan had woven for her unwary feet. The fact is, there is a great deal concerning all these people, Hester Mason, and Dr. Everett, and Joy Saunders, and Joy Saunders' mother, which I should have liked to tell you if I could have found room. You may read them any time, however, if you choose, in a book called An Endless Chain. Of course, the story of their lives does not end even there, because the chain is, as I said, endless; but there are many of the links presented to view. So Gracie Dennis went home, and neither then nor afterward did Mrs. Roberts hear in detail the story of Professor Ellis. What matter? She had, however, a short added chapter. It came in a letter from Mrs. Marion Dennis not long after Gracie's return. It read thus: "Oh, Flossy Shipley Roberts, blessed little scheming saint that you are! What did you do? How did you do it? Ah, I know more about it than those sentences would indicate. The dear Lord did it, working through you, His servant. He has called our Gracie to higher ground, filled her heart with that which has made insignificant things take their true place, and wrong things show for what they are. You know, of course, that it is all right about Professor Ellis; or no, I fear it is all wrong about him, but right with our Gracie. I hear that he has permanently located in your city. Perhaps your Christian Charity can reach him. He sent Gracie a letter trying to explain certain affairs about that Mason girl, with which I presume you are familiar. She showed me the letter and her answer. He will not write her another." "I don't know any Mason girl," said Mrs. Roberts to her husband, "but it doesn't matter. I don't want to know the story if there is nothing to be done through it. There are stories enough that one must know." End of chapter 29. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 30 of Ester Ried Yet Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ester Ried Yet Speaking by Pansy. Chapter 30. It is no made-up affair. It was Monday evening, and there was company at Mr. Roberts' home. Not the usual Monday evening gathering, but quite a large party of well-dressed men and women, many of them young, yet some were middle-aged. The pretty room opposite the conservatory was thrown open, and aglow with lights and flowers; and groups were continually passing in and out, admiring the paintings and the flowers, and the typewriters of different patterns, and the books and magazines, of which there were many. But interest was not confined to this room. The parlors were thrown open and the music room beyond; even the cozy little library was public property for this one evening. The company was large, and their tastes were varied, so no pains had been spared to give them variety. You are acquainted with quite a number of the guests, yet I am by no means sure that you would recognize them all. Even in so short a period of time as 3 years great changes may be elicited. For instance, do you know the young man in unnoticeable and therefore appropriate evening dress, who is doing duty at the piano, watching with practiced eye the course of the player, and turning the leaf with skillful hand at just the right moment? It is a somewhat embarrassing position, but his manner leads you to suppose that he has been accustomed to it all his life, and that he reads music well. In the latter belief you are correct, but as to being accustomed to it, 3 years ago Nimble Dick could have told you a different story. You can't believe that it is he? I do not wonder. The change is certainly a great one. But he does not feel it. To tell you the truth, he almost forgets, when he becomes absorbed in his work, that this sort of society was not always open to him. 3 years means a long time to the young, and Richard Bolton has so long been accustomed to the freedom of Mrs. Roberts' parlors, and to the sort of people whom one finds there, that none of the refinements of polite life are strange to him. And as to turning music, has he not done it for his hostess numberless times? If your eyes are now opened, it is possible that you may be trying to spy out other young men. The rooms are full of them, elegantly dressed, fashionable young men. But a few are noticeable by the air which they have of being in a sense responsible for the comfort of the others. They are on the alert. They are taking care that no young guest shall appear for a moment to be forgotten or neglected. They appear to be entirely familiar with the house and all its appointments. They can be appealed to for a glass of water or an ice, or to know what special scene this landscape hanging over the mantel represents, or whose bust this is in the niche at the left, or in what portion of the library a certain book will be found, or from what part of the foreign world that strangely shaped shell came, and they are all equally at home. In short, it is like having a dozen or 20 young hosts to look after your comfort and pleasure. In point of fact, there are 17 of them. The original 7 has thus increased. 2 months ago there were 20, but one has secured an appointment as telegraph operator in a distant city, and as Stephen Crowley occupies a similar position in one of the offices in this city, some very interesting conversations are held, and many important items connected with the Monday evenings, and the South End School, and the Library Association, etc., are transmitted when the lines are not otherwise employed. Young Haskell, too, has gone with one of the partners from the store where he was first employed to set up a branch store in a not distant town, and his old Sabbath school teacher has already received letters from him, saying that they have started a branch Sunday school in the south part of the town, and that he has picked 7 little wretches out of the streets, from 8 to 12 years of age, and gone to work. And, dear Mrs. Roberts, I wish you would pray for me, that I may be able to bring every one of them to Christ. So the letter ran, and that tells volumes to the initiated about young Haskell. But although the changes among these young men have been great almost to bewilderment, only one of the number has been promoted to a dazzling height. The others are without exception earning good, honest livings for themselves, securing good, substantial educations through the evening classes which have grown out of that first effort, bidding fair to become leading and honored citizens when they actually take their places as men. But Mark Calkins, faithful, plodding, good-hearted, patient Mark, has surpassed them all. The truth is, that eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, nor hath entered into the heart, what sort of magnificence surrounds him now. He has gone to court. The chief ruler of the realm has sent for Mark to be always in his immediate presence in the palace; and with what joy he went I cannot tell you; nor how often they speak of him, and try to let their hearts conceive of the glory which surrounds him, and dwell on the day when they will be called, one after another, to share the same glory; for this is the ambition of more than half of them. Now in that sentence is unveiled the most curious part of my curious story; and that it is curious, I frankly admit. It is no made-up affair. I am not responsible for the strangeness of it. You are to remember that truth is stranger than fiction, and then to understand that I am telling you the truth. It is, then, a fact, that these young men have each received conditional appointments to serve in the palace, high in power and splendor and dignity. The conditions are that they are to be willing to be guided in all things by the will of their king, whom they each admit to be wise above all wisdom, and to be kind above all their conceptions of kindness. It is true that 9 of the number have accepted their appointments, donned their uniform, assumed their positions as he has directed, and are waiting for the summons to appear in person at court. It is also true that the others are still in a state of indecision; they do not know whether to accept the appointment or not. It is true that they feel themselves honored, that they believe this to be the only path of honorable and safe promotion. It is true that they have full faith in those who tell with joy, that, having enlisted, they find the service even in this anteroom sweet, and the rewards great. It is true that they severally visited Mark, just as the door was opening to admit him to the palace, and heard him speak of the glimpses of its glory, and heard that his last words before he went away were, "Oh, mine eyes see the King in his beauty," and that his voice was jubilant as that of a conqueror, and his face radiant as with a reflection of unseen glory; and yet they hesitate, and dally with the call, and mean, sometime, to have such an inheritance deeded to them, but not now. Remember, I am not responsible for this. Were I writing fiction, I should hesitate to set down such idiotic folly, expecting you to call it unnatural or absurdly overdrawn; but I do solemnly declare to you that this is fact. Account for the folly of their behavior as best you can. Well, Sallie and her father are left behind; but, mind you, they are not among the doubtful ones. They both as much expect to serve at court as they expect to live through all eternity; but while they wait, they are busy. They have moved from the alley; the surroundings were not such as they liked. Did you notice that bit of a house standing modestly back from the road, at the further corner of those ample grounds that surround the South End Church? It's the sexton's house, and that church, and those Sunday school rooms, and those grounds, and everything pertaining to them, are under his care. The father is the sexton, it is true, and attends the furnace and rings the bell; but it is Sallie's care that keeps seat and desk and window so beautifully free from dust or stain. Oh, they live busy lives, and happy ones. Sallie trusted not in vain in her father's promise that night, when he put his weak will into the pledge; but you are to understand that it was but a few days thereafter when he planted his weak and wavering feet on the Rock of Ages. Then did Satan angle for him in vain. So on this Monday evening there were but 17 at the gathering. I hesitate over what to name the gathering. I would call it a party, but that in many respects it was so totally different from anything with which you are probably acquainted by that name. The young man who stands by the door of the conservatory, eagerly describing to Miss Henderson a rare and curious flower, which has been sent to Mrs. Roberts from California, is Black Dirk. Really, I hope you are sufficiently astonished; for he looks so utterly unlike the scamp who used to be the special torment of the South End Mission, that I should be disappointed if you were not impressed by it. Mr. Colson almost everybody calls him now. The name has long since lost its strangeness. He is in the employ of the great firm of Bostwick, Smythe, Roberts & Co., and although Mr. Roberts has never found it convenient to do so before, there are reasons why he thought it would be well to have a clerk within call. So Mr. Colson boards with what was the junior partner of the firm. He is so no more, by the way, for Mr. Ried has been received as a member, and is decidedly a junior partner. Probably Mr. Roberts could tell you, if he chose, why one so young, and without capital, had been elected to partnership; but, as a rule, he keeps his own counsel, only remarking that the young man developed remarkable business faculties which were patent to the whole firm. To his wife he said: "I tell you, Flossy, I believe a consecrated life will be honored by the Lord, in whatever channel he gives it talents to develop. Whatsoever he doth shall prosper. That young man is going to have a career in business. I shouldn't be surprised if the Master meant him to show the world how a Christian can use money to his glory." It is early yet to prophesy what Mr. Colson will do. Doubtless he will be a merchant, certainly he will be a Christian, possibly he will be an orator of whom the world will yet hear, a temperance orator, for instance. I know you would like to hear him read a poem. He is not confined to Will Carleton's style now, though he still reads with power some of those inimitable delineations of life; but Gracie Dennis offers no more criticisms when he reads. In fact, I have heard her defer to him, when a question arose, as one who had probably studied the passage and caught its best. I am willing to confess that my poor black Dirk was a bit of a genius. The thought I desire you to catch is that so many of these poor fellows, who of necessity live by their wits in the city slums, are diamonds which could be fitted to shine. You take a diamond and throw it down in the dirt and filth, and put your foot on it and grind it in, and leave it there, sinking and soiling, day after day, year after year, and when somebody comes along and picks it out, how much will it gleam for him at first? Yet the diamond is there. Thou shalt be a royal diadem in the hand of thy God. Mrs. Roberts had been at work hunting diamonds for his diadem. As Mr. Colson stood there chatting freely with Miss Henderson, there was nothing about the association that looked incongruous, neither did it occur to any. There was not a trace of embarrassment about this boy from the slums. He had forgotten the slums, and stood talking with one of the aristocrats of the city. How came she to talk with him, to allow herself to be entertained by him? Let me tell you, thereby hangs a tale. Some time before this evening, in fact nearly 2 years before, Mrs. Roberts had come to a puzzle, and stood and looked at it doubtfully. Then she presented it to the others. "They are growing easy in their manners with me, learning to be gentlemanly without embarrassment, and thoughtful over little things without being ashamed of it. But I am afraid that with other ladies they would be sadly frightened and awkward. When Mrs. Delaney came in this evening I could but notice how utterly silent Mr. Colton became. He had been talking well before. It seems as though there was a great gulf between them and social advancement. How can we bridge it?" Then young Ried ventured his thought. "My sister Esther had a class in the Center Street Sabbath School, nice little girls, who wore pretty dresses, and had their hair curled, and came from the best families. After she was taken sick, she told me one of her regrets was that she had not stayed well long enough to try a plan which she had. She meant to take a class of rough little boys in the mission school, and she meant to ask the mothers of the little girls to let them come, once a month, and play with the little boys from the streets, she to play with them, and watch over them every moment, but to try to interest the girls in teaching the boys gentleness and good manners. I don't know how it would have worked. Esther was never well enough to undertake it, nor could she seem to enlist any one else in such service. It has grave objections, I suppose, but I have always thought that I should like to see something of the kind carefully tried." Mrs. Roberts, before this little story was half concluded, had turned those eager eyes of hers on the speaker, eyes that always had a peculiar light in them whenever her soul took in a new suggestion. "Thank you," she said. "I see, oh, a great many things. I ought to have called in that dear sister Esther to help on this phase of the question before. It has always seemed to me as though we were doing her work." End of chapter 30. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 31 of Ester Ried Yet Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ester Ried Yet Speaking by Pansy. Chapter 31. Their Works Do Follow Them. That was the beginning of a new effort. There were certain young ladies becoming well known to Mrs. Roberts by reason of a similarity of tastes which drew them to her. She sat down one day and wrote out their names with great care on her tablets. Miss Henderson's name headed the list. She was one of the aristocrats. I use the word in its highest sense. The accidents of wealth and position were hers; at least, that is the way we talk, though I suppose we all believe that the Lord is the giver of both, and will require an account of the same at our hands. If this be so, Miss Henderson will be more ready than some with her rendering, for she is of royal blood, and guards well the honor of the Christian name she bears. Without hesitation, Miss Henderson headed the list. The others were chosen more slowly, 10 of them, picked soldiers, to do special duty in His name. It required much explanation, much care to plan wisely. But the girls caught at the idea. In the course of weeks they formed a band, with Miss Henderson for president. Ostensibly they were a literary society, really they were diamond polishers. They met one evening by invitation with Mrs. Roberts and made the acquaintance of the Monday Club. They sang for them, read for them, heard them read, chatted with them on the various topics of the hour, the last lecture of the course, which all had attended. A certain book carefully read and criticized by Mr. and Mrs. Roberts and Dr. Everett in the Monday Club, not so carefully read by the young ladies; therefore it came to pass that they were somewhat worsted in an argument concerning it, which was bad neither for the young ladies nor the Monday Club. Finally they were taken out to supper by these young men, who had so far come under Mrs. Roberts' influence that they were willing to endure torture for the sake of pleasing her. It is a long story. I could write another book about it just as well as not. The main difficulty would be that the critics would pronounce the story overdrawn. They always do when one revels in facts. It is only when an author keeps within the range of sober fiction that he may feel comparatively safe from this charge. These young ladies represented other parlors and other dining rooms. They arranged for little graceful entertainments, to which the Monday Club was invited. Gradually others were invited too, good, solid men, and wise-hearted, motherly women. The invitations were select, the polishers were chosen with care; but it was surprising to these workers to find how large the Christian world is, and how many stood ready to help if they were shown love. "It is one of the best suggestions that dear Esther has given us," this Mrs. Roberts said one evening when the Young Ladies' Band and the Monday Club combined their forces and gave an entertainment to some of the best people on the avenue. "I have given you hints of how they did it. They were every one Christians, these young ladies; none others were chosen. They worked with a single aim in view, His glory. They took no step that was not paved with prayer. Do you need to be told that they succeeded?" This was one of the reasons why Mr. Colson chatted with Miss Henderson with perfect freedom, and why his bow was graceful and easy when she introduced him to her friend Miss Fanshawe, of Philadelphia. He was accustomed to being introduced to her friends. "I'm sure I hope you wish I would tell you somewhat of Mart Colson. If you are not deeply interested in her I am disappointed in you. She has been such an object of interest to me since that time when I caught a glimpse of her once through the cellar window, with a gleam of sunset making her hair into gold. It is a summer evening of which I tell you, and she is all in white, except her eyes; nothing can be bluer than they are to-night; and except the flowers about her; she is always among the flowers. I hesitate, after all, to tell you about Mart. Hers is one of those stories hard to tell. Besides, her friend and patron has suffered much criticism because of her, and though Mrs. Roberts does not care in the least, I find that I am sensitive. Has she really kept that Colson girl with her all these years? Yes, she has. I speak it meekly, but she has. And never had her learn a trade, or work in a factory, or learn to support herself in any way? She has never sent her anywhere to learn a trade, or to work in a factory, or to stand behind a counter, it is too true. No, I was almost sure you would not approve of it. But, for all that, I don't mean to argue Mrs. Roberts' cause. To her own master she standeth or falleth. Not but what Mrs. Roberts has argued on occasion, with Gracie Dennis, for instance, who paid her a few weeks' visit less than 3 months after she first went home. "Flossy," she would say, "what are you going to do with the girl? Do you really mean to keep her here?" "She has no mother, my child, nor father, and her brother is not able to care for her yet. Where would you have me send her?" "Why, Flossy, there are places." "Yes, my dear, I know it, and this is one of them." "Well, but she ought to be learning things. How is she going to support herself?" "She is studying arithmetic with me, you know, and writing and reading with the dining room girls; and I am teaching her music, and Mr. Roberts proposes to have her join the history class as soon as she is sufficiently advanced in the more common studies." "But, Flossy Shipley, that is great nonsense. You know what I mean. You cannot turn the world upside down in that fashion, or make an orphan asylum of your house or a charity school." "My dear, do you really think the house is in danger? Does it look like an orphan asylum, or feel like a charity school?" Then would Gracie Dennis laugh, but look a trifle vexed, nevertheless, and mutter that people couldn't do things that way in this world. Then would Flossy be ready with her gentle drops of oil to soothe the ruffles. "Gracie, dear, I am not trying to reform the world. There are a great many girls left destitute, I know, and I will do at wholesale all I can for them; but this one is peculiar. You have admitted that it was unusual to see such dangerous beauty, and she is unusual in her mental development. She could be fierce and wicked. She is ignorant and bitter about many things. I am afraid for her. I have not been able to think of a place where the Lord Jesus would have me take her. I must see to it that He is pleased, you know, at all hazards. If He does not mean us to keep her in the shelter of our home for the present, we do not know what He means. We cannot mother the whole race. He has not even suggested it to our hearts. He has simply said, 'Here, take this one, there is room for her. Keep her until I plainly tell you that her place is elsewhere.' Gracie, would you have me tell Him we cannot?" By this time Gracie would be humble and sweet. "It is very good of you," she would say, meekly, "and I was not thinking of such a thing as finding fault. I was only wondering whether, you know, whether such a life as she is leading in your house would not unfit her for her proper sphere." But a sentence like that was always liable to put little Mrs. Roberts on all the dignity she possessed. Her husband had ideas on that subject, and had imbued her with them. Her voice could even sound almost haughty as she said: "As to that, Gracie, we must remember that the sphere of an American woman is the one that she can fill acceptably in God's sight. He may call her to the highest, I don't know. Since she is the daughter of a king, there may be no spot on His footstool too high for His intentions concerning her." There was outside criticism, of course. Indeed, Mrs. Roberts was sufficiently peculiar in many respects to call for such criticism from the world. They talked much about "that girl" she had picked up. Gradually they said "that Colson girl," then one day some daughter asked, "Is she really a sister of that handsome Mr. Colson in the store?" And by there were some who spoke of her as "Mattie Colson." That was the name which Mrs. Roberts always called her. It began gradually to be known also that Mattie Colson knew a great deal which was worth knowing. 3 years of companionship with a lady like Mrs. Roberts, and such as she gathers about her, can do much for a girl who wishes much done for her. As to "earning her living," I am not sure but she was learning to do it in several ways. Mrs. Roberts struggled against all false ideas of life, therefore taught her none. She was not the cook, but she could, and had on occasion, served up a most enjoyable breakfast. She was not the second girl, yet her fingers were undeniably skillful in the arrangement of rooms and tables. She was not the sewing girl, yet constant were the calls on fingers that had become wise in these directions. She was by no means the nurse, yet there was a little golden-haired Flossy in the sunny room upstairs, whose devoted slave she was, and whose mother felt that Mattie's loving, watchful care over her darling was only second to her own, and was so to be relied upon, by day and night, as to repay tenfold whatever she might have done for the girl. In fact, it would perhaps be difficult to define Mart Colson's position in the house. Yet she was, as I said, becoming known among the young ladies outside as "Mattie Colson, that handsome young Colson's sister, as pretty as a doll, and a protégée of that lovely Mrs. Roberts, you know." As for the young ladies' band, I do not include them when I talk of the girls "outside." What they had done for Mattie Colson she could not have told you though she tried, her eyes shining with tears. The days had come wherein the very matrons who had said that it was a strange thing for Mrs. Roberts to take a girl from the slums into her family, that it was "tempting Providence to attempt such violent wrenches," now said to one another, that "it must be a great relief to Mrs. Roberts to have that Mattie Colson always at her elbow to see that everything about the home was just as it should be;" and they added, with a sigh, that "some people were very fortunate." Now, dear critic, you stand all ready to say that this is a very nice paper story, but that in actual life attempts at doing good do not result so smoothly; that to be natural, Mrs. Roberts ought, at least, to have tried in vain to reclaim half of her boys. It is true, I have said nothing to you about 2 or 3 whom she has not as yet reached, though she is still trying. My story was not of them, but of the 20 whom she did reach. Concerning your verdict, there are 2 things that I want to say. First, go into the work, and give the time and patience and faith and prayer that Mrs. Roberts and her fellow workers gave before you decide that it is vain. And secondly, will you kindly remember that, whether this be natural or not, it is true? I do not think I have told you the immediate occasion of this particular gathering. It was, in fact, a reception given to Mrs. Ried. It is not likely that I need tell you at this late day that her name was Gracie Dennis Ried. I could have told you much about it, had I been writing a story of that sort. In fact, there is a chance for considerable romancing. There are matters of interest that I might tell you, about Mr. Colson himself, young as he is, and about Mattie, who wears tonight a rose that she did not pick from the conservatory, but I don't mean to tell it. I have just one other bit of history to give you. They stood together for a moment, the young bridegroom and the lady with whom he had faithfully worked ever since that rainy afternoon in which he had confided his gloom to her. Both were looking at the 2 young men who stood near the piano, waiting to join in the chorus. Both had known these young men as Nimble Dick and Black Dirk. Still another of the original 7 stood in the immediate vicinity. The glances of the 2 workers took them all in. Then they looked at each other and smiled meaningly. "I have been thinking of that first Sunday afternoon," said Mrs. Roberts. "I asked them to pick up my handkerchief, which had dropped, and Nimble Dick said, 'Pick it up yourself, Mum, you're as able to as we be.' I wonder if they would remember it. What if I should tell them?" As she spoke, the bit of cambric in her hand designedly dropped almost at the feet of Dirk Colson. He stooped for it instantly, but Nimble Dick was too quick for him, and presented it to the owner with a graceful bow and a slightly triumphant smile. But the chorus was commencing, and the bass and tenor were at once absorbed in their work; so Mr. Ried and Mrs. Roberts had the memorial laugh all to themselves. None but they understood what the white handkerchief said. Despite the laughter there was a suspicious mist in Mr. Ried's eyes. "How far is mirth removed from tears?" he asked his hostess. And then, "Do you know, when I look at these young men, moving about your rooms at their ease, really ornaments to society, and think of the places in the world that they will be likely to fill, and think of what they were when you first saw them, the overwhelming contrast brings the tears." Said Mrs. Roberts, "I will tell you something that will do your heart good. Did you know that our young lady helpers had reorganized in larger force, and with certain fixed lines of work which they feel certain they can do? The effort has passed out of the realm of mere experiment. They have chosen a name. They are henceforth to be known as the Ester Ried Band. They came to me for a motto to hang in their rooms below the name, and I gave them this: And I heard a voice from heaven saying unto me, Write, Blessed are the dead which die in the Lord from henceforth. Yea, saith the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, and their works do follow them. End of Chapter 31. Recording by Trisha G. End of Ester Ried Yet Speaking by Pansy.